The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, along with their respective allies, after World War II. Spanning from the mid-1940s to the early 1990s, this ideological conflict shaped global politics for nearly half a century. The United States, representing the capitalist Western Bloc, and the Soviet Union, leading the communist Eastern Bloc, engaged in a struggle for supremacy without direct military confrontation, relying instead on proxy wars, nuclear arms races, and espionage. The Cold War influenced everything from military strategies and political alliances to economic policies and cultural movements. As the two superpowers vied for influence, the world witnessed significant events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, marking the end of this tense era. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated with more history stories. The Cold War was one of the most defining periods of modern world history, shaping global politics, economics, military strategies, and ideological conflicts for nearly half a century. Unlike traditional wars marked by direct, large-scale battles between opposing armies, the Cold War was primarily a struggle of influence, power, and ideology between two dominant blocs, the United States and its allies on one side, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other. This period, which roughly spanned from the end of World War II in 1945 to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, transformed international relations and left a lasting impact on nearly every region of the world. The roots of the Cold War can be traced back to the final years of World War II, when the alliance between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain began to weaken. Although these nations had cooperated to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, their cooperation was based on necessity rather than genuine trust. The United States and Britain represented capitalist democracies that emphasized free markets, political pluralism, and individual liberties. In contrast, the Soviet Union followed a communist system rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology, which promoted state control over the economy, one-party rule, and the collective ownership of resources. These fundamental ideological differences created deep suspicion and hostility even before the war officially ended. During World War II, the Soviet Union had suffered immense human and material losses, with millions of citizens killed and vast territories destroyed. As a result, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was determined to secure his country's borders and prevent future invasions. To achieve this, the Soviet Union sought to establish a buffer zone of friendly governments in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the war economically stronger than ever, with its industrial capacity intact and its influence expanding across the globe. American leaders believed that economic recovery, political stability, and the spread of democratic institutions were essential to preventing future conflicts. These competing visions for post-war Europe quickly brought the former allies into conflict. The tension became evident during a series of wartime and post-war conferences, including the Yalta Conference in February 1945 and the Potsdam Conference later that year. At Yalta, leaders Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin discussed the future of Europe, particularly the fate of Germany and Eastern Europe. Although agreements were reached on issues such as the division of Germany into occupation zones and the promise of free elections in liberated countries, many of these agreements were vague and open to interpretation. At Potsdam, disagreements became more pronounced, especially as the United States revealed its possession of a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb, which further altered the balance of power and intensified Soviet fears. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 marked the beginning of the nuclear age and profoundly influenced the Cold War. The United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons initially gave it a significant strategic advantage, but it also alarmed the Soviet leadership. Stalin accelerated Soviet efforts to develop nuclear weapons, leading to the first successful Soviet atomic test in 1949. From that moment onward, the Cold War became a nuclear standoff in which both sides possessed the ability to destroy each other. This concept, later known as mutually assured destruction, discouraged direct military confrontation, but increased global anxiety and the constant fear of nuclear war. In the immediate post-war years, Europe became the primary battleground of Cold War tensions. Much of the continent lay in ruins, facing economic collapse, food shortages, and political instability. The United States responded by introducing the Marshall Plan in 1947, a massive economic aid program designed to rebuild Western European economies. American officials believed that economic recovery would strengthen democratic governments and reduce the appeal of communism. The Soviet Union, however, viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to expand American influence and undermine communist movements. As a result, Stalin rejected the plan and pressured Eastern European countries under Soviet control to do the same, deepening the division of Europe. This division became increasingly formalized as Europe split into two opposing blocs. In the West, nations aligned with the United States embraced democratic governance and market economies, while in the East, Soviet-backed communist governments consolidated power. Germany, the defeated heart of Europe, became a symbol of this division. The country was split into two states: West Germany, aligned with the United States and Western Europe, and East Germany, under Soviet influence. Berlin, located deep within East Germany, was itself divided, reflecting the broader ideological and political split that would define the Cold War. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism extended far beyond Europe. Both superpowers sought to expand their influence across the globe, often intervening in the political affairs of other nations. The United States adopted a policy known as containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism wherever it appeared. This policy was articulated by American diplomat George Kennan, who argued that the Soviet Union's expansionist tendencies could be contained through firm and vigilant opposition. Containment became the foundation of U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, shaping its actions in Europe, Asia, and beyond. In response, the Soviet Union pursued its own strategy to secure and expand its influence. It supported communist parties and movements in various countries, provided economic and military assistance to allied regimes, and sought to challenge Western dominance in international institutions. The establishment of rival alliances further solidified the global divide. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance committed to collective defense. The Soviet Union later responded by creating the Warsaw Pact, binding Eastern European countries into a military alliance under Soviet leadership. The early Cold War years were marked by intense propaganda campaigns on both sides. Each superpower portrayed the other as a threat to peace, freedom, and human progress. In the United States, communism was often depicted as an evil ideology that sought to destroy democracy and individual freedoms. In the Soviet Union, capitalism was portrayed as exploitative, imperialistic, and inherently unstable. These narratives shaped public opinion and justified foreign and domestic policies, including military spending, political repression, and ideological education. Fear and suspicion also influenced domestic politics within both blocs. In the United States, the late 1940s and early 1950s saw the rise of anti-communist sentiment, culminating in the era known as McCarthyism. Accusations of communist infiltration spread through government, entertainment, and academia, leading to investigations, blacklists, and violations of civil liberties. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe,
communist regimes suppressed dissent, controlled the media, and used secret police to maintain power. These internal dynamics reinforced the perception of an irreconcilable struggle between two opposing systems. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had become a global conflict, influencing events on every continent. Although direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was avoided, smaller conflicts and crises began to emerge, often involving proxy wars in which each superpower supported opposing sides. The Korean War, which erupted in 1950, would become the first major armed conflict of the Cold War era, demonstrating how ideological rivalry could turn local disputes into international crises. This escalation marked a new phase in the Cold War, one in which the struggle for influence increasingly involved military force, even if the superpowers themselves avoided direct combat. Thus, the first phase of the Cold War was defined by the breakdown of wartime alliances, the clash of ideologies, the division of Europe, and the emergence of a nuclear-armed standoff. It was a period of uncertainty, fear, and rapid change, setting the stage for decades of rivalry that would shape the modern world. The foundations laid during these early years would influence international relations, conflicts, and political systems for generations to come, making the Cold War not just a historical period, but a defining chapter in human history.
By the early 1950s, the Cold War had moved beyond diplomatic tension and ideological rivalry and entered a more dangerous phase, marked by open conflict, military alliances, and global confrontation. While the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct war with each other, their competition increasingly played out through proxy wars, regional conflicts, and political interventions across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. This period demonstrated how deeply the Cold War had become embedded in global affairs, transforming local disputes into international crises and reshaping the political destiny of entire nations. One of the first and most significant military confrontations of the Cold War was the Korean War, which began in 1950. After World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel, with the Communist North supported by the Soviet Union and later China, and the capitalist South backed by the United States. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea, the conflict quickly escalated into a major international war. The United Nations, led primarily by U.S. forces, intervened to defend South Korea, while China entered the war in support of the North. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice rather than a peace treaty, leaving Korea divided to this day. The Korean War demonstrated the willingness of both superpowers to use military force indirectly and confirmed that the Cold War could turn violent without becoming a direct U.S.-Soviet war. The Korean conflict also intensified the militarization of the Cold War. Defense spending rose dramatically, and both superpowers expanded their conventional and nuclear arsenals. The United States adopted the policy outlined in NSC 68, a strategic document that called for a massive military buildup to counter perceived Soviet expansionism. This policy reflected a growing belief among American leaders that the Cold War was a global struggle requiring constant vigilance and readiness. Similarly, the Soviet Union strengthened its military forces and consolidated control over Eastern Europe, ensuring that communist governments remained firmly in power. During this period, nuclear weapons became central to Cold War strategy. The development of hydrogen bombs by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the early 1950s vastly increased the destructive power of nuclear arsenals. These weapons were far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped during World War II, capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. As both sides built stockpiles of nuclear weapons and developed long-range bombers and missiles, the world entered an era of unprecedented danger.
the fear of nuclear annihilation became a constant presence in global politics and popular culture alike. Despite this danger, nuclear weapons also created a paradoxical form of stability. The concept of deterrence emerged, based on the idea that neither side would launch a nuclear attack because doing so would result in its own destruction. This balance of terror, later known as mutually assured destruction, discouraged direct conflict between the superpowers. However, it also meant that crises carried the risk of catastrophic escalation, making diplomacy and crisis management critically important. The Cold War rivalry expanded rapidly beyond Europe and East Asia, particularly as former colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East gained independence. This process of decolonization created new nations that often became arenas for Cold War competition. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to influence these emerging states by offering economic aid, military support, and ideological guidance. In many cases, local leaders used Cold War rivalries to their advantage, seeking support from one or both superpowers to strengthen their own positions. In Southeast Asia, Cold War tensions deepened following the end of French colonial rule in Indochina. Vietnam was divided into a communist North and a non-communist South, mirroring the earlier division of Korea. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Asia, increasingly supported the South Vietnamese government, while the Soviet Union and China backed the North. Although large-scale American military involvement would come later, the foundations of the Vietnam conflict were laid during this early Cold War period, illustrating how containment shaped U.S. foreign policy far from Europe. The Middle East also became a strategically important region in the Cold War. Its vast oil resources and critical geographic position made it a focus of superpower interest. The United States sought to maintain stability and protect access to oil supplies, while the Soviet Union aimed to expand its influence by supporting nationalist and anti-Western movements. Events such as the 1953 Iranian coup, in which Western powers supported the overthrow of Iran's prime minister, reflected the extent to which Cold War concerns influenced political interventions. These actions often had long-term consequences, contributing to regional instability and resentment toward foreign interference. In Europe, Cold War tensions remained high throughout the 1950s. The division of Germany continued to symbolize the broader ideological split, and Berlin remained a focal point of confrontation. In 1948–49, the Soviet blockade of West Berlin and the Western response through the Berlin airlift had already demonstrated how quickly crises could escalate. Throughout the following decade, Berlin remained a source of tension, as millions of East Germans fled to the West in search of greater freedom and economic opportunity. This mass migration exposed the weaknesses of the communist system and embarrassed Soviet authorities. At the same time, the Soviet Union faced challenges within its own sphere of influence. After the death of Stalin in 1953, a period of uncertainty and change followed. Khrushchev eventually emerged as the new leader and initiated a process known as de-Stalinization. He denounced Stalin's cult of personality and some of his brutal policies, signaling a shift in Soviet politics. Although the Soviet system remained authoritarian, these changes raised hopes for reform and greater autonomy within Eastern Europe. However, these hopes were often crushed. In 1956, a popular uprising in Hungary demanded political reform and an end to Soviet domination. The Soviet Union responded with military force, sending tanks into Budapest to suppress the revolt. The violent suppression of the Hungarian Revolution shocked the world and revealed the limits of Soviet tolerance for dissent within its bloc. It also highlighted the moral contradictions of the Cold War, as Western powers condemned Soviet actions but did little to intervene, fearing a wider conflict. The Cold War was not only a military and political struggle, but also a competition in science, technology, and culture. Each superpower sought to demonstrate the superiority of its system through achievements in education, industry, and innovation. This rivalry became especially visible with the launch of Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, and its success stunned the United States. Many Americans feared that Soviet technological superiority could translate to military advantage, particularly in missile technology. In response, the United States invested heavily in science and education, leading to the expansion of research programs and the creation of institutions such as NASA. The space race became a powerful symbol of Cold War competition, with each side striving to achieve milestones that would capture global attention. Beyond its technological significance, the space race reflected the broader ideological struggle, as both superpowers sought to inspire allies and impress neutral nations. Cultural competition also played a significant role during this period. The United States promoted its values through films, music, consumer culture, and international exchanges, presenting an image of freedom, prosperity, and modernity. The Soviet Union, in turn, emphasized achievements in industry, science, and social welfare, portraying communism as a path to equality and progress. Propaganda became a powerful tool, shaping perceptions at home and abroad, and reinforcing the sense of a divided world. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had become a complex and deeply entrenched global system. It influenced nearly every aspect of international relations, from diplomacy and warfare to economics and culture. Although open conflict between the superpowers had been avoided, the risks of escalation remained ever present. Crises could erupt suddenly, driven by miscalculation, misunderstanding, or local conflicts that drew in larger powers. This phase of the Cold War laid the groundwork for even more intense confrontations in the decades to come. The patterns established during these years, proxy wars, nuclear deterrence, ideological rivalry, and global competition, would continue to define the Cold War as it moved into the
By the early 1960s, the Cold War had reached one of its most dangerous and dramatic phases. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was no longer confined to ideological debates or distant proxy conflicts. It now threatened to erupt into a direct nuclear confrontation. Both superpowers possessed vast nuclear arsenals, advanced delivery systems, and global networks of allies. The world lived under the constant shadow of annihilation, as political decisions made by a small number of leaders carried consequences for all of humanity. One of the most significant developments of this period was the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. For years, East Germany had suffered from a massive outflow of its population, as millions fled to the west through the open border in Berlin. This migration undermined the East German economy and exposed the failures of the communist system. To stop this exodus, the East German government, with Soviet approval, erected a fortified barrier dividing East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall quickly became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, representing not only the physical division of Germany, but also the ideological division of the world. While Western leaders condemned the wall as a symbol of oppression, the Soviet bloc defended it as a necessary measure to protect socialism. The tensions surrounding Berlin reflected a broader pattern of Cold War crises, where local issues carried global implications. At the same time, Cold War competition intensified in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Cuba. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 brought Fidel Castro to power, overthrowing a U.S.-backed dictatorship. Although Castro initially did not declare himself a communist, his government soon aligned with the Soviet Union, nationalized American-owned businesses, and challenged U.S. influence in the region. For the United States, the presence of a Soviet-aligned government just 90 miles from its shores was deeply alarming. In 1961, the United States attempted to overthrow Castro through a covert operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban exiles, trained and supported by the CIA, landed on the island with the goal of sparking an uprising. The operation failed disastrously, strengthening Castro's position and pushing Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. The failure embarrassed the United States and convinced Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that American power could be challenged, setting the stage for an even more dangerous confrontation. That confrontation came in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, widely regarded as the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. The United States discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of striking major American cities within minutes. President John F. Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade, demanding the removal of the missiles. For 13 tenth days, the world watched as the two superpowers stood on the brink of catastrophe. Ultimately, a negotiated settlement was reached. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba, while the United States pledged not to invade the island and secretly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis highlighted the extreme dangers of the Cold War and underscored the need for better communication and restraint. In the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both superpowers took steps to reduce the risk of accidental war. A direct communication link, known as the Hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to allow leaders to communicate quickly during crises. Efforts were also made to limit nuclear testing, leading to the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. While these measures did not end the arms race, they marked an important shift toward arms control and crisis management. Despite these efforts, Cold War conflicts continued to intensify in other parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War became the most significant and controversial conflict of the Cold War era. What began as a struggle between Communist North Vietnam and the anti-Communist South gradually escalated into a major war involving hundreds of thousands of American troops. The United States viewed the conflict through the lens of containment and the domino theory, fearing that the fall of South Vietnam would lead to the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. The Soviet Union and China provided support to North Vietnam, turning the war into a major proxy conflict. The Vietnam War revealed the limits of military power and deeply divided American society. Despite superior technology and firepower, the United States struggled to defeat a determined and adaptable enemy. Televised images of the war brought its brutality into people's homes, fueling protests and anti-war movements. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, public opposition to the war had grown significantly, forcing American leaders to reconsider their strategy. The war ultimately ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, marking a major setback for U.S. Cold War policy. While the United States grappled with Vietnam, the Soviet Union faced its own challenges within the communist bloc. In 1968, reform movements emerged in Czechoslovakia during a period known as the Prague Spring. Under the leadership of Alexander Dubček, the government attempted to introduce political reforms, greater freedom of expression, and a more humane form of socialism. These changes alarmed Soviet leaders, who feared that reform could spread to other Eastern European countries. In response, Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia, crushing the reform movement and reasserting Soviet control. The invasion demonstrated that despite talk of reform, the Soviet Union was unwilling to tolerate significant challenges to its authority. As the Cold War continued, a new phase known as détente emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s. Détente was characterized by a relaxation of tensions, increased diplomatic engagement, and efforts to manage competition more peacefully. Both superpowers recognized that endless confrontation was costly and dangerous.
Strategic arms limitation talks led to agreements such as SALT I, which placed limits on certain types of nuclear weapons. Economic and cultural exchanges increased, and high-level summits became more common. While rivalry persisted, détente represented a shift away from constant crisis toward a more stable, if uneasy, coexistence. The Cold War also increasingly involved China, adding a new layer of complexity to global politics. Although China was a communist state, relations between Beijing and Moscow deteriorated in the 1960s due to ideological differences and border disputes. This Sino-Soviet split weakened the unity of the communist bloc and created new opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering. The United States took advantage of this division by improving relations with China in the early 1970s, most notably through President Nixon's visit to Beijing in 1972. This realignment reshaped the global balance of power and demonstrated that Cold War alliances were not fixed or monolithic. Beyond military and diplomatic developments, the Cold War continued to shape societies and cultures around the world. In both blocs, governments invested heavily in education, science, and technology, viewing these areas as essential to national strength. The space race reached a dramatic milestone in 1969 when the United States successfully landed astronauts on the moon. This achievement was celebrated as a triumph of American ingenuity and a powerful symbol of technological superiority. For many, it represented the peaceful potential of scientific competition, even amid global rivalry. By the mid-1970s, the Cold War had evolved into a complex system of competition and cooperation, conflict and compromise. While the threat of nuclear war remained, both superpowers had developed mechanisms to manage their rivalry and avoid direct confrontation. Yet underlying tensions persisted, and many regions of the world continued to suffer from proxy wars, political instability, and foreign intervention. The Cold War was far from over, and new challenges would soon emerge to test the fragile balance between the superpowers. Thus, Part 3 of the Cold War story reveals a world living on the edge, shaped by dramatic crises, devastating wars, and cautious steps toward cooperation. It was an era that demonstrated both the destructive potential of ideological conflict and the human capacity for restraint in the face of unimaginable danger. The events of this period would profoundly influence the final decades of the Cold War and determine how this global struggle would eventually come to an end.
By the late 1970s, the Cold War had entered a new and uncertain phase. The period of détente that had characterized much of the previous decade began to weaken as trust between the United States and the Soviet Union eroded. Although arms control agreements and diplomatic engagement had reduced tensions temporarily, deep ideological differences and strategic rivalries remained unresolved. New crises and shifting global dynamics soon brought the Cold War back to a more confrontational posture, reminding the world that the struggle between the two superpowers was far from over. One of the most significant events that marked the end of détente was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet leadership viewed Afghanistan as strategically important and feared the spread of instability near its southern borders. When a communist government in Kabul faced growing opposition, the Soviet Union intervened militarily to support it. The invasion shocked the international community and was widely condemned by the United States and its allies. For many in the West, it appeared to confirm long-held fears of Soviet expansionism. In response, the United States imposed economic sanctions, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and increased military assistance to Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen. The conflict would become one of the longest and most costly wars in Soviet history. The war in Afghanistan had far-reaching consequences for the Cold War. It intensified hostility between the two superpowers and contributed to a renewed arms race.
the United States, under President Ronald Reagan, adopted a more aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire and called for a significant expansion of American military power. Defense spending increased dramatically, and new weapons systems were developed, including advanced nuclear missiles and the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed missile defense system intended to protect the United States from nuclear attack. These policies aimed to pressure the Soviet Union economically and strategically, but they also heightened fears of confrontation. At the same time, the Soviet Union faced growing internal problems. Its economy was stagnating, burdened by inefficiency, corruption, and the high cost of military spending. Living standards lagged behind those of the West, and technological innovation struggled to keep pace. The war in Afghanistan further strained Soviet resources and morale as casualties mounted and victory remained elusive. Within Eastern Europe, dissatisfaction with communist rule continued to simmer, even as governments maintained control through repression and surveillance. The early 1980s were marked by several dangerous Cold War crises that underscored how fragile global stability remained. In Europe, the deployment of new nuclear missiles by both NATO and the Warsaw Pact sparked widespread protests and anxiety. Many Europeans feared that their continent would become the primary battleground in a nuclear war. In 1983, a NATO military exercise known as Able Archer was misinterpreted by some Soviet officials as a possible preparation for a real attack, bringing the superpowers dangerously close to conflict. Such incidents highlighted the risks of miscalculation and misunderstanding in a heavily armed and deeply divided world. Despite these tensions, the Cold War began to change dramatically in the mid-1980s with the rise of a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Recognizing that the existing system was unsustainable, Gorbachev introduced a series of reforms aimed at revitalizing the Soviet Union and reducing international tensions. His policies of perestroika, or economic restructuring, and glasnost, or political openness, represented a significant departure from previous Soviet practices. Gorbachev believed that meaningful reform at home required a less confrontational relationship with the West. Gorbachev's approach transformed Cold War diplomacy. He sought to reduce the arms race, improve relations with the United States, and resolve regional conflicts. A series of high-profile summits between Gorbachev and U.S. President Ronald Reagan marked a turning point in superpower relations. These meetings led to important arms control agreements, most notably the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles from Europe. For the first time, the superpowers agreed not just to limit, but to actually reduce their nuclear arsenals, signaling a profound shift in Cold War dynamics. The impact of Gorbachev's reforms extended beyond the Soviet Union itself, particularly in Eastern Europe. Unlike previous Soviet leaders, Gorbachev made it clear that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to maintain control over its satellite states. This change, often referred to as the abandonment of the Brezhnev Doctrine, gave Eastern European countries greater freedom to pursue their own paths. As a result, reform movements gained momentum across the region, challenging decades of communist rule. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolutions swept through Eastern Europe. In Poland, negotiations between the government and the Solidarity labor movement led to semi-free elections and the formation of a non-communist government. In Hungary, the government dismantled border controls with the West, allowing citizens to travel freely. In East Germany, mass protests and political pressure led to the opening of the Berlin Wall in November 1980. The fall of the Berlin Wall became one of the most iconic moments of the 20th century, symbolizing the collapse of the division that had defined the Cold War for decades. The rapid changes in Eastern Europe reshaped the global political landscape. Communist regimes fell one after another, often without violence, as people demanded democracy, economic reform, and national sovereignty. The Warsaw Pact dissolved, and Germany moved toward reunification. These developments marked the effective end of the Cold War in Europe, as the ideological and military division of the continent disappeared almost overnight. Within the Soviet Union, however, the process of reform proved far more complex and challenging. While Glasnost encouraged open discussion and criticism, it also exposed deep social, economic, and political problems. Nationalist movements emerged in several Soviet republics, demanding greater autonomy or independence. Economic reforms struggled to deliver immediate improvements, leading to shortages and uncertainty. As central authority weakened, the cohesion of the Soviet state began to unravel. In 1991, the Cold War reached its definitive conclusion with the collapse of the Soviet Union. After a failed coup attempt by hardline communists, power shifted away from the Central Soviet government. One by one, the Soviet republics declared independence, and the Union formally dissolved in December 1991. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, and the bipolar international system that had defined global politics for nearly half a century came to an end. The end of the Cold War marked a profound transformation in world history. For some, it represented the triumph of democracy and free markets over authoritarian communism. For others, it signaled a beginning of a new and uncertain era characterized by regional conflicts, economic globalization, and shifting power dynamics. While the Cold War had ended, its legacy continued to shape international relations, political institutions, and collective memory. Thus, Part 4 of the Cold War story captures the dramatic final chapter of this global struggle. It is a story of escalation and exhaustion, reform and resistance, collapse and renewal. The Cold War did not end with a decisive battle or a formal treaty, but through a complex process of change driven by human choices and historical forces. Its conclusion reshaped the modern world and continues to influence how nations understand power, security, and cooperation in the 21st century.
The end of the Cold War in 1991 did not mark the end of history, nor did it instantly bring peace and stability to the world. Instead, it opened a new and complex chapter in global affairs. The sudden collapse of the Soviet Union transformed international politics, reshaped national identities, and left behind unresolved conflicts, economic challenges, and ideological questions. While the Cold War rivalry between two superpowers had ended, its consequences continued to influence global relations, security policies, and political systems well into the 21st century. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the bipolar international system that had dominated global politics for nearly 5 decades gave way to a unipolar moment. American political, military, economic, and cultural influence expanded rapidly across the globe. Many policymakers and scholars believed that liberal democracy and free market capitalism had triumphed, leading to optimism about a more peaceful and cooperative world order. This belief was famously described as the end of history, suggesting that ideological conflict had been resolved in favor of Western democratic values. However, the transition was far from smooth, particularly in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The collapse of communist systems created power vacuums, economic disruption, and social uncertainty. Many former socialist states struggled to transition from centrally planned economies to market-based systems. Rapid privatization, often poorly regulated, led to widespread corruption, inequality, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. In Russia, the 1990s were marked by economic hardship, declining living standards, and political instability, which deeply affected public attitudes toward democracy and the West. At the same time, the breakup of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of 15 independent states, each facing its own challenges. Issues of national identity, borders, and governance became pressing concerns. In some regions, long-suppressed ethnic and nationalist tensions erupted into violent conflict. Wars in the Caucasus, including conflicts in Chechnya, Georgia, and later Ukraine, demonstrated that the end of the Cold War did not eliminate geopolitical rivalry or the use of force. Instead, it transformed the nature of conflict, shifting from ideological confrontation to struggles over territory, power, and influence. Eastern Europe experienced a different, though still difficult, transition. Many countries embraced democratic reforms and sought integration with Western institutions, such as the European Union and NATO. These efforts brought economic growth and political stability to some states, but they also generated tensions with Russia, which viewed NATO expansion as a threat to its security. The legacy of Cold War divisions continued to shape perceptions and policies as memories of past domination and rivalry influenced contemporary decision-making. The Cold War also left a profound impact on global security structures. Military alliances formed during the Cold War, particularly NATO, did not disappear with the Soviet Union's collapse. Instead, NATO expanded its membership and redefined its mission, taking on new roles in crisis management, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism. This evolution reflected the changing nature of global threats, but also raised questions about the alliance's purpose in a post-Cold War world. Meanwhile, the absence of a clear rival comparable to the Soviet Union led to debates about how to manage international security in a unipolar system. Nuclear weapons remained one of the most enduring legacies of the Cold War. Although the risk of a large-scale nuclear confrontation between superpowers diminished after 1991, thousands of nuclear weapons continued to exist. Arms control agreements reduced stockpiles, but concerns about nuclear proliferation grew as more states sought or acquired nuclear capabilities. The Cold War had demonstrated both the deterrent power and the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons, leaving future generations with the challenge of preventing their use while managing their existence. The ideological legacy of the Cold War also persisted in subtle and complex ways. While communism as a global revolutionary movement declined, debates over the role of the state, economic inequality, and social justice continued. In many parts of the world, distrust of Western intentions remained strong, shaped by memories of Cold War interventions, proxy wars, and support for authoritarian regimes. These historical experiences influenced how nations responded to globalization, international institutions, and Western-led initiatives. In the developing world, the end of the Cold War brought both opportunities and challenges. During the Cold War, many countries had received economic or military support by aligning with one of the superpowers. With the disappearance of this rivalry, some states lost strategic importance and external assistance. This shift exposed underlying problems, such as weak institutions, poverty, and internal divisions. At the same time, the absence of superpower competition allowed some regional conflicts to be resolved through negotiation as external pressures eased. Culturally and socially, the Cold War left a deep imprint on collective memory. Generations had grown up under the constant threat of nuclear war, shaped by propaganda, fear, and ideological division. Films, literature,
Music and art reflected these anxieties, creating a shared global experience of tension and uncertainty. After the Cold War, societies began to reassess this past, opening archives, re-examining historical narratives, and debating responsibility and memory. This process of reflection was often painful, but essential for understanding the true costs of the Cold War. Education and historical interpretation became important battlegrounds in the post-Cold War era. Different countries told different stories about the Cold War, emphasizing their own experiences and perspectives. In some cases, former communist regimes were condemned for repression and human rights abuses, while in others, the social achievements of socialism were remembered with nostalgia. These competing narratives highlighted the complexity of the Cold War and resisted simple interpretations of victory and defeat. The Cold War also reshaped the global economy in lasting ways. Military spending, technological innovation, and competition had driven advances in science, aerospace, computing, and communications. Many of these technologies found civilian applications after the Cold War, contributing to economic growth and globalization. At the same time, the integration of former socialist economies into the global market transformed trade, labor, and production, creating new opportunities but also new inequalities. In international relations, the end of the Cold War led to a re-evaluation of diplomacy and power. Without a clear ideological enemy, foreign policy priorities shifted toward issues such as terrorism, climate change, economic development, and human rights. However, the habits and assumptions formed during the Cold War did not disappear overnight. Suspicion, rivalry, and strategic competition continued to shape relations among major powers, even as the ideological framework changed. By the early 21st century, it became increasingly clear that the Cold War's legacy was not confined to the past. New tensions between Russia and the West, rising competition with China, and renewed debates over spheres of influence suggested that elements of Cold War thinking were re-emerging in new forms. While the world was no longer divided strictly between capitalism and communism, struggles over power, values, and global order remained central to international politics. Thus, Part 5 of the Cold War story is not merely an epilogue, but a reflection on how deeply this conflict shaped the modern world. The Cold War ended without a final battle, but its influence continued to shape institutions, relationships, and ideas. It taught humanity both the dangers of ideological extremism and the importance of dialogue, restraint, and cooperation. Understanding the Cold War's legacy is essential for navigating the challenges of the present and avoiding the mistakes of the past. In this sense, the Cold War is not just a chapter in history, but a framework through which much of the contemporary world can still be understood. Its shadow lingers in global politics, reminding us that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the result of conscious choices, shared responsibility, and a willingness to learn from history.
The Cold War, which dominated global affairs for nearly half a century, stands as one of the most complex and influential periods in human history. Unlike earlier great conflicts, it was not defined by a single battlefield or a clear beginning and end marked by declarations and treaties. Instead, it unfolded gradually, shaped by fear, ideology, ambition, and the unprecedented power of modern weapons. By examining the Cold War as a whole, it becomes clear that its true significance lies not only in what happened, but in how it reshaped the way nations think about power, security, and coexistence. At its core, the Cold War was an ideological struggle. Capitalism and communism represented competing visions of how societies should be organized, how wealth should be distributed, and how political authority should be exercised. For the United States and its allies, the Cold War was framed as a defense of freedom, democracy, and individual rights. For the Soviet Union and its supporters, it was portrayed as a fight against exploitation, imperialism, and inequality. These competing narratives were deeply internalized by governments and populations alike, making compromise difficult and suspicion inevitable. Yet ideology alone does not fully explain the Cold War. Historical experience played a crucial role. The Soviet Union's desire for security was shaped by repeated invasions and immense suffering during World War II. The United States' determination to prevent the spread of communism was influenced by its belief in economic openness and its fear that instability would lead to future global wars. Both sides believed they were acting defensively, even as their actions appeared aggressive to the other. This mutual misunderstanding fueled a cycle of escalation that defined much of the Cold War era. One of the most striking features of the Cold War was the absence of direct large-scale war between the two main rivals. Despite moments of extreme tension, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly. This restraint was largely due to the existence of nuclear weapons. The knowledge that any major conflict could result in mutual destruction forced leaders to exercise caution, even when rhetoric and posturing suggested otherwise. In this sense, fear became a stabilizing force, preventing catastrophe while simultaneously creating constant anxiety. However, the avoidance of direct war did not mean an absence of violence. The Cold War was fought through proxy wars, revolutions, coups, and civil conflicts across the globe. From Korea and Vietnam to Afghanistan, Angola, and Central America, millions of people experienced the Cold War not as a distant standoff, but as a brutal reality. These conflicts often reflected local grievances, but they were intensified and prolonged by superpower involvement. The human cost of these wars remains one of the most tragic legacies of the Cold War. The Cold War also transformed the nature of global power. Military strength became inseparable from technological and scientific advancement. The arms race drove rapid innovation in fields such as aerospace, computing, nuclear physics, and communications. The space race, while symbolic of rivalry, also demonstrated humanity's capacity for exploration and achievement. Many technologies developed for Cold War competition later became essential to everyday life, illustrating how even periods of intense conflict can produce unintended benefits. Culturally, the Cold War shaped identities, values, and worldviews. In both East and West, education systems, media, and popular culture were infused with ideological messages. Films, literature, and art reflected fears of invasion, nuclear destruction, and loss of freedom. At the same time, cultural exchange programs, sports competitions, and scientific cooperation revealed moments of shared humanity across ideological divides. These interactions reminded people that the Cold War was ultimately a conflict between systems, not between ordinary individuals. The end of the Cold War challenged long-held assumptions about history and progress. The collapse of the Soviet Union appeared to confirm the superiority of liberal democracy and market economics, leading to optimism about a more peaceful world. Yet this optimism proved premature. New conflicts emerged, old rivalries resurfaced, and inequalities persisted. The disappearance of a single clearly defined enemy did not eliminate competition or conflict, it merely changed their form. In retrospect, the Cold War can be seen as both a warning and a lesson. It demonstrated how fear and ideology can divide the world into rigid camps, making cooperation difficult even when mutual survival is at stake. At the same time, it showed that dialogue, diplomacy, and restraint are possible even under the most dangerous conditions. Arms control agreements, crisis hotlines, and diplomatic engagement were not signs of weakness, but tools of survival. The Cold War also forces us to reconsider the meaning of victory and defeat. While the Western Bloc emerged stronger in the immediate aftermath, the costs of the Cold War were shared by all. Resources that could have been used to address poverty, disease, and environmental challenges were instead devoted to weapons and military preparedness.
Entire generations lived under the threat of annihilation, shaping psychological and social attitudes in ways that are still felt today. For former Cold War societies, memory remains contested. In some places, the Cold War is remembered as a time of oppression and lost opportunities. In others, it is recalled with nostalgia for perceived stability or social guarantees. These differing memories influence contemporary politics and international relations, reminding us that history is not just a record of what happened, but a guide to what might happen again. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Cold War is the danger of absolute thinking. When the world is divided into us and them, compromise becomes betrayal, and empathy becomes weakness. The Cold War thrived on such divisions, turning complex realities into simplified narratives. Over time, these narratives hardened into assumptions that shaped policy and justified suffering. Breaking free from this mindset remains one of the greatest challenges of the post-Cold War world. As the 21st century unfolds, echoes of the Cold War can still be heard. Strategic competition, arms buildups, ideological rivalry, and mistrust among major powers suggests that history has not ended, but evolved. Yet the Cold War also provides a roadmap for avoiding disaster. It shows that even in times of deep division, communication matters, understanding matters, and the recognition of shared humanity matters most of all. In the final analysis, the Cold War was not simply a struggle between two superpowers, but a global experience that shaped the lives of billions. It influenced how nations define security, how leaders calculate risk, and how societies understand freedom and responsibility. Its legacy is complex, neither wholly tragic nor wholly triumphant, but deeply human. Thus, Part 6 serves as a reminder that history is not just a record of what happened, but a guide to what might happen again. The Cold War teaches us that power without wisdom is dangerous, ideology without compassion is destructive, and peace without effort is fragile. Remembering this history is not an academic exercise alone, it is a responsibility, one that can help future generations navigate a world still shaped by the shadows of the past.
Although the Cold War officially ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, its influence did not disappear. Instead, the Cold War transformed, reshaping itself into new forms of rivalry, competition, and strategic thinking. The ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism faded, but the habits, institutions, and fears created during decades of confrontation continued to shape global politics. Part 7 of the Cold War story explores how the post-Cold War world inherited unresolved tensions and how the logic of the Cold War still echoes in modern international relations. In the years immediately following the Cold War, many believed that the world was entering a new era of cooperation. International organizations expanded their roles, globalization accelerated, and democratic governance spread across large parts of the world. The absence of a rival superpower appeared to give the United States unprecedented freedom to shape global norms and institutions. Military interventions in the 1990s, such as those in the Balkans, were often framed as humanitarian actions rather than ideological struggles. Yet beneath this optimism lay deeper structural issues inherited from the Cold War era. One of the most enduring legacies of the Cold War was the global security architecture it created. Alliances, military bases, intelligence networks, and defense doctrines designed to counter a Soviet threat did not vanish. NATO, rather than dissolving, expanded eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact members and even former Soviet republics. While this expansion was welcomed by many Eastern European nations seeking security, it was perceived by Russia as a continuation of Cold War containment under a different name. This divergence in interpretation became a major source of post-Cold War tension. Russia's post-Cold War trajectory was deeply shaped by its Cold War past. The loss of superpower status, combined with economic collapse and political instability in the 1990s, created a sense of humiliation and resentment. Many Russians viewed the end of the Cold War not as a mutual resolution, but as a defeat exploited by the West. This perception influenced Russian foreign policy in the following decades, leading to efforts to reassert influence over neighboring regions and challenge Western dominance. In this way, Cold War-era thinking about spheres of influence never fully disappeared. At the same time, the United States struggled to adapt to a world without a clear ideological enemy. During the Cold War, American foreign policy had been guided by containment and the need to counter communism. In the post-Cold War era, threats became more diffuse and complex. Terrorism, cyber warfare, regional conflicts, and economic competition replaced the singular focus on a rival superpower. Yet Cold War assumptions about military superiority and global leadership continued to shape policy decisions, sometimes leading to overreach and unintended consequences. The rise of China represents one of the most significant post-Cold War developments influenced by Cold War history. During the Cold War, China had been both an ally and a rival to the Soviet Union, and later a strategic partner of the United States against Soviet power. After the Cold War, China pursued rapid economic growth while maintaining political control, creating a system that did not fit neatly into Cold War categories. As China's power expanded, competition with the United States intensified, reviving familiar Cold War language about rivalry, influence, and ideological difference, even though the context was fundamentally different. This renewed great power competition demonstrates how Cold War frameworks continue to shape modern thinking. Terms such as New Cold War are frequently used to describe tensions between major powers, reflecting a tendency to interpret contemporary conflicts through historical analogies. While these comparisons can be useful, they also risk oversimplifying complex realities. Unlike the original Cold War, today's world is deeply interconnected economically and technologically, making outright separation far more difficult. Nuclear weapons remain another powerful reminder of the Cold War's unfinished business. Despite reductions in arsenals since the early 1990s, nuclear deterrence continues to influence global security. New nuclear states have emerged, and existing nuclear powers have modernized their weapons. The logic of mutually assured destruction developed during the Cold War still underpins strategic thinking, even as new technologies such as cyber weapons and artificial intelligence complicate traditional deterrence models. The Cold War also left a lasting imprint on international norms and values. Concepts such as human rights, sovereignty, and intervention were shaped by Cold War debates and compromises. During the Cold War, both superpowers often supported authoritarian regimes for strategic reasons, undermining their stated ideals. In the post-Cold War era, efforts to promote democracy and human rights have been met with skepticism in regions that remember Cold War interventions. This historical memory continues to influence global perceptions of legitimacy and trust. Socially and psychologically, the Cold War shaped generations in ways that are still visible today. The constant threat of nuclear war created a culture of fear, preparedness, and suspicion. Even after the Cold War ended, these attitudes did not disappear overnight. They influenced how societies respond to crises, how governments communicate threats, and how media frames international conflict. The persistence of enemy images reflects the deep psychological impact of prolonged ideological confrontation. Education and historical memory play a crucial role in how the Cold War continues to matter. Different countries teach different versions of the Cold War history, emphasizing their own experiences and interpretations. These narratives shape national identity and foreign policy attitudes. In some cases, Cold War history is used to justify contemporary policies, reinforcing divisions rather than promoting understanding. The way the Cold War is remembered thus becomes a political issue in itself.
The technological legacy of the Cold War has reshaped the modern world. Surveillance systems, intelligence gathering, and information control developed during the Cold War have evolved into sophisticated digital technologies. While these tools offer new capabilities, they also raise ethical questions about privacy, power, and accountability. The tension between security and freedom, a central Cold War dilemma, remains unresolved in the digital age. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Cold War for the modern world is the need for adaptability. The Cold War persisted for decades because both sides were trapped in rigid assumptions about each other's intentions and capabilities. When change finally came, it was driven by leaders willing to rethink those assumptions. In today's rapidly changing world, clinging to outdated frameworks can be just as dangerous as abandoning caution altogether. The Cold War also reminds us that global conflicts are rarely inevitable. They are shaped by choices, perceptions, and interactions. While structural forces matter, human agency plays a decisive role. The avoidance of nuclear war during the Cold War was not guaranteed. It was the result of restraint, communication, and at times sheer luck. Recognizing this fragility is essential for managing contemporary global risks. In conclusion, Part 7 shows that the Cold War did not simply end, it evolved. Its structures, ideas, and consequences continue to influence the world in visible and invisible ways. Understanding the Cold War as a living legacy rather than a closed chapter allows us to better grasp the challenges of the present. The Cold War's greatest warning is that prolonged rivalry can become self-sustaining, while its greatest hope lies in the possibility of change through dialogue and understanding. The story of the Cold War extended into the post-Cold War world is ultimately a story about humanity's capacity for both destruction and restraint. It teaches that power must be balanced by responsibility, that ideology must be tempered by empathy, and that peace is not a permanent state, but an ongoing process. As long as nations continue to compete, remember, and reinterpret the Cold War, its lessons will remain essential for navigating the future.
The Cold War was not only a historical confrontation between superpowers, but also a vast human experiment in survival under constant threat. As the world moves further away from the events of the 20th century, the Cold War continues to offer powerful lessons about power, fear, cooperation, and responsibility. Part 8 explores what the Cold War teaches future generations, not as a closed chapter, but as a guide for understanding modern global challenges and preventing the repetition of past mistakes. One of the most important lessons of the Cold War is the danger of absolute ideological certainty. Both sides believed deeply in the moral superiority of their systems, often viewing compromise as weakness and dialogue as betrayal. This mindset reduced complex societies into simplistic categories of friend and enemy, making peaceful coexistence difficult. The Cold War demonstrates how rigid ideology can blind leaders to reality, escalate tensions unnecessarily, and justify actions that cause immense human suffering. In a world still divided by political, religious, and cultural differences, this lesson remains profoundly relevant. Another critical lesson is the power of fear in shaping international behavior. The Cold War was driven not only by ambition, but by fear. Fear of invasion, fear of subversion, fear of annihilation. Nuclear weapons magnified this fear to an unprecedented level. While fear sometimes prevented direct conflict through deterrence, it also fueled arms races, proxy wars, and repression. Understanding how fear operates in global politics is essential for managing modern threats, whether they involve nuclear weapons, terrorism, pandemics, or climate change. The Cold War also highlights the importance of communication. Many of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War resulted from misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or lack of direct contact. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed how close the world came to catastrophe due to miscalculation. The establishment of communication channels and arms control agreements demonstrated that dialogue, even between enemies, can reduce risk. In today's fast-moving world, where decisions can be made in seconds, the need for clear and reliable communication is greater than ever. Restraint is another key lesson. Despite intense rivalry, leaders on both sides often chose restraint over escalation. This restraint was not guaranteed and sometimes depended on individual judgment rather than institutional safeguards. The Cold War teaches that systems alone cannot prevent disaster. Human decision-making remains crucial. Training leaders to think critically, empathize with adversaries, and consider long-term consequences is essential for maintaining global stability. The Cold War also reveals the unintended consequences of power politics. Superpower interventions, often justified by ideological competition, destabilized regions and caused long-term harm. Many conflicts that continue today have roots in Cold War-era decisions. This legacy underscores the importance of humility in foreign policy and the recognition that external solutions rarely address internal problems effectively. Sustainable peace requires understanding local contexts rather than imposing external agendas. Another lesson lies in the resilience of societies. Despite living under the constant threat of nuclear war, people continued to build families, create art, pursue education, and imagine better futures. Civil society movements, such as peace campaigns and human rights activism, played an important role in shaping public debate and influencing policy. These movements remind us that ordinary people are not passive spectators in global affairs. They can shape history through collective action and moral pressure. The Cold War also teaches us the value of adaptability. The conflict lasted so long, in part because both sides were slow to adapt to changing realities. When adaptation finally occurred, particularly in the late 1980s, it transformed the global system. This lesson is especially relevant in an era of rapid technological and social change. Clinging to outdated assumptions can be as dangerous as reckless innovation. Successful societies and institutions must balance continuity with flexibility. Education and historical awareness emerge as essential tools for preventing future conflicts. Misunderstanding the Cold War can lead to the repetition of its mistakes. Simplistic narratives of victory and defeat obscure the complexity of the conflict and the shared responsibility for its outcomes. Teaching the Cold War as a multifaceted human story, rather than a moral drama with clear heroes and villains, encourages critical thinking and empathy. The Cold War also offers lessons about global cooperation. Even at the height of rivalry, the superpowers cooperated on issues such as arms control, space exploration, and public health. These examples demonstrate that cooperation is possible, even in deeply divided systems. In a world facing global challenges that no single nation can solve alone, this lesson is particularly important. Climate change, pandemics, and technological risks require collaboration beyond ideological boundaries. Technology, a central feature of the Cold War, provides another set of lessons. Technological competition drove innovation, but also increased the speed and scale of destruction. Today, emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence, cyber weapons, and biotechnology, present similar dilemmas. The Cold War reminds us that technological power must be matched by ethical reflection and international regulation to prevent catastrophic misuse. The psychological legacy of the Cold War deserves attention. Decades of rivalry created deep-seated patterns of mistrust that did not disappear with the end of the conflict. These patterns continue to influence how nations perceive each other and respond to crises.
Recognizing and addressing these psychological legacies is essential for building genuine trust and reducing the risk of miscalculation. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Cold War is the fragility of peace. Peace during the Cold War was not the result of harmony, but of careful management of conflict. It required constant effort, negotiation, and compromise. This understanding challenges the idea that peace is a natural or permanent state. Instead, peace must be actively maintained through institutions, norms, and shared commitments. The Cold War also teaches us about the limits of power. Despite vast military and economic resources, neither superpower achieved complete security or ideological dominance. Power created influence, but also vulnerability. This paradox remains relevant in a world where military strength does not guarantee stability and economic power does not ensure legitimacy. In reflecting on the Cold War, it becomes clear that its lessons are not confined to international relations. They apply to any situation involving deep division, competition, and fear. The Cold War serves as a reminder that conflict is not inevitable, that dialogue is possible, and that human choices matter. As future generations confront new forms of rivalry and uncertainty, the Cold War stands as both a warning and a source of guidance. It warns against the dangers of dehumanizing adversaries, escalating fear, and placing blind faith in power. At the same time, it offers hope by showing that even the most entrenched conflicts can change through courage, imagination, and cooperation. Thus, Part 8 concludes the extended Cold War narrative by looking forward rather than backward. The Cold War is not merely a story of the past, it is a mirror reflecting the challenges of the present and the possibilities of the future. By learning from its lessons, humanity can strive to build a world where competition does not lead to catastrophe, and where differences are managed through understanding rather than destruction.
As the world moved deeper into the 21st century, it became increasingly clear that the Cold War had not simply faded into history. Instead, its patterns, assumptions, and structures continued to shape global politics in subtle and powerful ways. While the ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism no longer defined international relations in the same way, competition among major powers, strategic mistrust, and the struggle for influence remained central features of the global system. Part 9 examines how Cold War logic reappeared in modern conflicts and how the legacy of that era continues to influence world affairs. One of the most visible ways the Cold War persisted was through the revival of great power competition. After a brief period of unchallenged dominance by the United States, other powers began to assert themselves more confidently. Russia sought to re-establish its influence in regions it considered historically and strategically important, while China emerged as a global economic and political force. These developments did not recreate the Cold War exactly, but they revived familiar dynamics of rivalry, deterrence, and competition that echoed the earlier era. Russia's relationship with the West provides a clear example of Cold War legacies in action. Many Russian leaders and citizens viewed NATO expansion and Western political influence as a continuation of Cold War containment. From this perspective, post-Cold War promises of partnership appeared hollow. Conflicts involving former Soviet territories revealed how unresolved Cold War-era borders, identities, and security concerns could re-emerge as sources of tension. These disputes were not driven by communist ideology, but by power, history, and national identity, factors that had always existed beneath the ideological surface of the Cold War. China's rise introduced a different but equally significant challenge to the post-Cold War order. Unlike the Soviet Union, China integrated deeply into the global economy while maintaining a distinct political system. This combination complicated traditional Cold War categories.
Economic interdependence made outright confrontation costly, yet strategic competition intensified in areas such as technology, trade, military presence, and global influence. The language used to describe this rivalry often borrowed from Cold War vocabulary, reflecting how deeply that historical framework still shapes thinking. The role of ideology also evolved rather than disappeared. While communism no longer served as a global revolutionary force, debates over governance, human rights, and political legitimacy continued. Competing models of development and authority emerged, challenging the assumption that liberal democracy represented the final stage of political evolution. These ideological differences, though less rigid than during the Cold War, still influenced alliances, diplomacy, and public opinion. Military power remained a central element of global competition, but its nature changed. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons defined the balance of power. In the modern era, conventional military strength, cyber capabilities, space assets, and information warfare gained importance. Yet nuclear deterrence did not vanish. Instead, it coexisted with new forms of conflict, creating a layered and complex security environment. The Cold War taught states how to manage nuclear risk, but applying those lessons to new technologies proved challenging. Information and propaganda, once delivered through radio broadcasts and printed materials, evolved into digital influence campaigns and social media manipulation. The Cold War had demonstrated the power of narrative and perception, and modern actors adapted these techniques to a connected world. Information warfare blurred the line between peace and conflict, making rivalry less visible but no less impactful. This transformation reflected the Cold War's enduring lesson that control over ideas can be as powerful as control over territory. The persistence of military alliances also reflected Cold War continuity. NATO remained a central institution in global security, even as its mission expanded beyond its original purpose. For some member states, NATO represented protection and stability. For others, it symbolized exclusion and threat. These differing interpretations mirrored Cold War-era divisions, demonstrating how institutions can carry historical meanings long after their original context has changed. At the same time, global challenges emerged that transcended Cold War-style rivalry. Climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, and technological risk required cooperation rather than confrontation. Yet Cold War habits of mistrust often hindered collective action. States sometimes viewed cooperation through the lens of competition, fearing that collaboration might advantage rivals. This tension highlighted the limits of Cold War thinking in addressing modern problems. The experience of smaller states also reflected the Cold War's legacy. During the Cold War, many countries were forced to align with one bloc or another. In the modern era, some states sought greater autonomy, balancing relationships among major powers to protect their interests. This strategy echoed Cold War non-alignment, but adapted it to a multipolar world. The desire to avoid becoming arenas for great power competition remained as strong as ever. Culturally, Cold War memory continued to shape identity and politics. Films, books, and public discourse revisited Cold War themes, often using them to interpret contemporary events. Nostalgia, fear, and myth intertwined, influencing how societies understood the past and the present. In some cases, Cold War narratives were revived to legitimate political agendas, demonstrating how history can be mobilized for modern purposes. Education and generational change also played a role. Younger generations, removed from the lived experience of the Cold War, often viewed it as distant history, yet they inherited institutions, technologies, and geopolitical realities shaped by that era. Bridging this gap between memory and reality became an important challenge, as misunderstanding the Cold War's complexity risked oversimplifying modern conflicts. The Cold War's influence extended even into economic policy. Globalization, which accelerated after the Cold War, was shaped by institutions and rules developed during that period. Trade systems, financial organizations, and development models reflected Cold War compromises and power structures. As globalization faced backlash in the 21st century, debates about fairness, sovereignty, and control echoed earlier ideological disputes. Perhaps the most important continuity between the Cold War and the modern world lies in the management of rivalry. The Cold War demonstrated that competition does not inevitably lead to catastrophe, but it also showed how easily miscalculation can escalate. Modern rivalries, though different in form, carry similar risks. Learning from Cold War crisis management, communication, restraint, and mutual understanding remains essential. At the same time, the differences between eras must be acknowledged. The world today is more interconnected, more technologically advanced, and more complex than during the Cold War. Simple analogies can mislead as much as they inform. Recognizing both continuity and change is crucial for navigating modern international relations. In reflecting on these developments, it becomes clear that the Cold War's greatest legacy is not a set of policies or alliances, but a way of thinking about conflict and cooperation. This mindset can be both a resource and a limitation. It offers valuable lessons about deterrence and diplomacy, but it can also trap leaders in outdated assumptions. Thus, Part 9 reveals a world still shaped by Cold War shadows, even as it faces new realities. The Cold War did not end with a clean break. It dissolved into the fabric of modern global politics. Understanding this continuity helps explain why tensions persist, why cooperation is difficult, and why history remains a powerful force in shaping the future. The story of the Cold War, extended into the present, reminds us that history does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. The challenge for humanity is to recognize these echoes, learn from them, and choose paths that avoid the mistakes of the past while adapting to the demands of a changing world.
The Cold War history seeks to move beyond chronology and events, reaching instead for understanding the deeper implications of nearly half a century of ideological rivalry, global tension, and human resilience. The Cold War was not merely a series of confrontations between two superpowers. It was a vast global experiment in balancing power, ideology, fear, and diplomacy. Its consequences extended far beyond the immediate political and military spheres, shaping economic systems, technological development, cultural expression, and collective psychology. Reflecting on this period is essential not only to understand the past, but to comprehend the framework in which the modern world continues to operate. At its heart, the Cold War was a study in extremes: extreme mistrust, extreme preparation for potential annihilation, and extreme investment in ideology as both a motivator and a justification for action. Both the United States and the Soviet Union believed their systems were not only superior, but existentially necessary for the survival of their respective societies. For decades, this belief guided decisions on strategy, alliances, and interventions around the globe. The ideological lens through which both superpowers viewed the world simplified complex human realities into black-and-white narratives, often dehumanizing those who did not align with either camp. This fundamental reduction of nuance created a framework in which miscalculation, propaganda, and fear became powerful drivers of policy. Yet the Cold War was also a paradox. While it created the threat of catastrophic war on a global scale, it simultaneously established mechanisms that prevented such a war from occurring. Nuclear weapons, by their terrifying potential, introduced a deterrent logic that neither side could ignore. The balance of terror, or mutually assured destruction, created a stability born not of trust, but of necessity. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 demonstrated how thin the line could be between peace and annihilation, and yet, through careful diplomacy, restraint, and communication, catastrophe was avoided. The lesson is clear. Survival often depends not merely on strength, but on the judicious use of restraint, foresight, and negotiation. The Cold War was fought on multiple fronts. While the superpowers avoided direct military confrontation, they engaged in countless proxy wars, intelligence operations, and covert interventions. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, and Central America all became theaters where local conflicts were amplified by superpower involvement. Millions of lives were lost, communities were devastated, and economies disrupted, often in regions far removed from the capitals where the primary decisions were made. These conflicts highlight a sobering truth. The pursuit of global influence carries enormous human cost, even when undertaken in the name of ideology, security, or perceived national interest. Economically, the Cold War reshaped the world. The United States leveraged its industrial and technological superiority to create an expansive capitalist network, encouraging trade, investment, and innovation aligned with Western markets. The Soviet Union, conversely, mobilized its economy around state planning and heavy industry, often at the expense of consumer well-being. Both systems demonstrated strengths and vulnerabilities: rapid technological advancement, military prowess, and organizational discipline on one hand, and inefficiency, stagnation, and rigidity on the other. The collapse of the Soviet Union revealed the limits of an isolated, inflexible system, while the adaptability and global integration of capitalist economies proved more resilient, yet not without their own crises and inequities. Technological development during the Cold War also left a profound legacy. The arms race drove innovations in aerospace, computing, nuclear energy, communications, and intelligence gathering. The space race, emblematic of the era, pushed humanity into orbit and eventually onto the moon, reflecting both the competitive spirit and the aspirational capacity that emerged from rivalry. While these achievements were initially driven by fear and competition, they ultimately expanded human knowledge and capability. The Cold War, in this sense, paradoxically propelled progress, even as it threatened destruction. Culturally, the Cold War shaped the identities, attitudes, and aspirations of generations. Citizens in both blocs lived under the constant presence of ideological messaging, propaganda, and the potential for nuclear confrontation. Art, literature, film, and music frequently reflected the anxieties, hopes, and contradictions of the era. Simultaneously, cultural diplomacy, through exchanges, performances, and international competitions, provided glimpses of shared human experience beyond ideological divides. These cultural currents remind us that, even amidst political and military tension, human creativity and expression persisted, influencing both the present and future. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the formal end of the Cold War in 1991 were momentous, yet they did not resolve all tensions or eliminate the frameworks established during the preceding decades. Russia, grappling with loss of influence, economic turmoil, and political uncertainty, experienced a profound sense of insecurity and historical grievance. Eastern European states, liberated from direct Soviet control, sought integration into Western institutions such as NATO and the European Union, sometimes provoking renewed friction with Moscow. Meanwhile, China emerged as a global economic powerhouse, creating a new axis of influence and competition. In this way, the Cold War did not end so much as evolve into new forms of rivalry, informed by history but shaped by contemporary realities. The modern world reflects the enduring consequences of the Cold War in multiple dimensions. Military alliances persist, intelligence networks continue to operate, and nuclear arsenals remain a cornerstone of strategic thinking.
Information warfare, cyber capabilities, and technological competition echo Cold War dynamics in new contexts. Even global institutions, created or influenced during the Cold War era, shape contemporary diplomacy, trade, and development strategies. These continuities underscore the persistence of structural and psychological legacies that outlast the formal ideological confrontation. Yet the Cold War also offers enduring lessons for the 21st century. Perhaps the most significant is the recognition that survival and progress depend on a balance of power and prudence, not merely on strength or ideology. The careful management of risk, the willingness to engage diplomatically with rivals, and the cultivation of shared understanding remain essential in a world of complex, interdependent threats. Nuclear weapons, climate change, global pandemics, and technological disruption all demonstrate the same principle. Human survival is contingent on foresight, restraint, and collaboration. Another enduring lesson lies in the moral and ethical responsibilities of global actors. The Cold War demonstrates the consequences of prioritizing strategic advantage over human well-being. Proxy wars, coups, and interventions often exacerbated suffering and instability, reminding us that power is inseparable from accountability. Contemporary policymakers and societies must consider the human dimension of strategy, recognizing that true security cannot be achieved through dominance alone. Education and historical consciousness are equally critical. The Cold War was long remembered in polarized, often simplistic terms, yet understanding its complexity, its successes, failures, and paradoxes is vital for avoiding repetition. Studying the Cold War as a multifaceted human story rather than a binary narrative of victory and defeat fosters critical thinking, empathy, and a nuanced approach to modern challenges. Awareness of history becomes a safeguard against repeating miscalculations, misunderstandings, and avoidable conflicts. The Cold War also offers insights into the role of uncertainty and contingency in global affairs. Much of the era's trajectory, whether the outcome of specific crises, the timing of reforms, or the collapse of regimes, depended on unpredictable events, leadership decisions, and even chance. Recognizing the limits of control reminds us that humility, preparation, and adaptability are essential qualities for nations and leaders navigating a complex, interconnected world. Ultimately, the Cold War serves as a mirror of human ambition and limitation. It reveals both the destructive potential of power and the remarkable capacity for restraint, innovation, and cooperation. Its history encourages reflection on what constitutes progress, security, and justice. While it was a conflict of nations and ideologies, it was also a deeply human story, shaped by choices, fears, aspirations, and the enduring struggle to reconcile ideals with reality. In conclusion, Part 10 encapsulates the Cold War as a defining epoch that continues to influence the 21st century. The ideological battles,
Even decades after the formal end of the Cold War, its influence continues to ripple across every dimension of global affairs. Part 11 explores how the ideological rivalry of the 20th century has shaped contemporary politics, economics, technology, culture, and international security. The Cold War, while ostensibly over, established frameworks, institutions, and thought patterns that continue to shape decision-making, alliances, and global perception. Understanding these lingering effects is essential for grasping the contemporary world order. One of the most profound legacies of the Cold War is the persistence of great power competition. While the United States initially enjoyed a period of unchallenged global dominance, other powers, particularly Russia and China, began to assert themselves in ways reminiscent of Cold War-era rivalries. Russia, grappling with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of geopolitical influence, has sought to reassert its power through both conventional and unconventional means.
Its military interventions in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine illustrate the enduring influence of Cold War-era strategic thinking, particularly regarding spheres of influence and territorial security. Similarly, China's rise represents a new form of competition that blends economic power, technological innovation, and military expansion. While China's model does not rely on ideological confrontation in the same way as the Soviet Union, its increasing assertiveness challenges U.S. global primacy and has sparked comparisons to a new Cold War. The Cold War's ideological legacy continues to shape global governance and political norms. During the Cold War, debates over democracy, human rights, and sovereignty were often subordinated to strategic imperatives, creating a complex interplay between morality and realpolitik. These debates did not vanish with the end of the Cold War, rather they evolved. Today, questions of governance, human rights, and legitimacy remain contested, particularly as countries like China, Russia, and others offer alternative models of political organization. The world has become ideologically pluralistic, yet the echoes of Cold War assumptions about superiority, influence, and the inevitability of liberal democracy still inform policy and perception. Economically, the Cold War shaped the development of global capitalism and international trade systems. The United States and its allies created institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later trade agreements that codified Western approaches to economic liberalization. Post-Soviet transitions often involved rapid market reforms, sometimes generating inequality, corruption, and instability. Meanwhile, globalized markets accelerated in the 1990s and 2000s, but the Cold War-era economic frameworks continued to influence how wealth, investment, and power were distributed internationally. Even today, debates over trade wars, sanctions, and global finance reflect the structural and institutional legacies of Cold War geopolitics. Technology remains a central area where Cold War influence is evident. The arms race, particularly nuclear development, prompted massive investment in research and innovation. Satellites, computing, aerospace, and early internet development were all accelerated by Cold War competition. These technological foundations have become integral to the modern global economy and security landscape. Cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and space exploration are contemporary arenas where the echoes of Cold War competition remain visible, as nations compete not just for territory or ideology, but for technological dominance. The Cold War's international security architecture also persists, albeit in transformed ways. NATO remains a central institution, and nuclear weapons continue to define strategic thinking. Despite reductions in arsenals, nuclear deterrence is still a critical factor in global diplomacy. New threats, such as cyber attacks, asymmetric warfare, and terrorism, coexist with traditional strategic concerns, creating a complex matrix of risk management. The Cold War taught the world that power alone does not guarantee security. Restraint, communication, and negotiation remain essential. This lesson is particularly relevant as contemporary crises, such as tensions in the Middle East, East Asia, and Eastern Europe, reflect both historical legacies and modern strategic calculations. Cultural and social consequences of the Cold War are equally enduring. Decades of ideological messaging, propaganda, and the pervasive threat of nuclear war shaped generations in ways that continue to influence perception, behavior, and political identity. Films, literature, and art produced during the Cold War reflected both anxiety and hope, often blending fear of annihilation with aspirations for peace. Even in the 21st century, these cultural narratives inform how people understand risk, morality, and national identity. They also influence contemporary politics, as nostalgia, historical memory, and ideological framing are mobilized in domestic and international discourse. The Cold War's legacy is also visible in international conflict resolution and diplomacy. Lessons learned from nuclear crises, arms control negotiations, and diplomatic brinksmanship have informed the management of modern crises. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the strategic arms limitation talks, and other negotiations demonstrated the value of communication, compromise, and careful calculation. Contemporary leaders continued to rely on these lessons, whether in preventing nuclear escalation, mediating regional disputes, or coordinating multilateral responses to shared challenges. In this sense, the Cold War serves as both a warning and a guide, highlighting both the dangers of miscalculation and the possibilities of cooperation. Another enduring effect of the Cold War is the global proliferation of intelligence and surveillance practices. During the Cold War, espionage was a critical instrument for gaining strategic advantage. While the methods have evolved, replacing analog spy networks with cyber intelligence and satellite surveillance, the fundamental logic remains the same. Information is power, and control over information shapes the balance of security and influence. Modern intelligence operations, including counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and strategic monitoring, owe much to the organizational structures and doctrines developed during the Cold War era. The Cold War also reinforced the interconnectedness of the world, even amid rivalry. Economic, technological, and cultural linkages often existed despite political tension. For instance, scientific exchanges, cultural diplomacy, and limited trade persisted between blocs. These interactions laid the foundation for globalization, demonstrating that engagement can coexist with competition. In the 21st century, similar dynamics play out in trade, technology sharing, and multilateral governance, reflecting lessons about the importance of simultaneous competition and cooperation. Environmental consequences also trace back to the Cold War. Military-industrial activity, nuclear testing, and the global arms race contributed to ecological disruption and environmental degradation. Awareness of these impacts has shaped contemporary environmental policy, particularly regarding nuclear waste, military pollution, and technological development. The Cold War highlighted the interconnectedness of human action and planetary consequence, a lesson increasingly relevant in addressing climate change and sustainable development. Finally, the Cold War teaches the enduring importance of historical memory and education. Misunderstanding or oversimplifying the Cold War can lead to policy errors, repeating the mistakes of the past. By studying the complex dynamics of competition, deterrence, ideology, and cooperation, societies can cultivate critical thinking, empathy, and foresight. Historical awareness helps policymakers, scholars, and citizens recognize the dangers of absolutism, fear-driven decision-making, and unchecked rivalry. It also inspires hope, demonstrating that even prolonged conflict can be resolved through dialogue, restraint, and human ingenuity. In essence, the Cold War's story is ongoing. Its events, decisions, and consequences continue to shape contemporary politics, economics, and culture. By studying its history, reflecting on its lessons, and applying them thoughtfully, humanity can confront current and future challenges with greater wisdom, foresight, and resilience. The Cold War is not merely history, it is a living legacy, shaping the way we understand power, influence, and our shared responsibilities in a globalized world.
The Cold War may have formally ended decades ago, yet its legacy continues to shape the trajectory of global politics, technological advancement, and international thought. Part 12 looks forward, exploring the enduring influence of Cold War-era strategies, assumptions, and institutions on the 21st century and beyond. While the ideological battle between capitalism and communism has largely faded, the structures, rivalries, and mental frameworks developed during the Cold War continue to shape decision-making, security concerns, and global competition. In examining potential futures, it is clear that the Cold War was not merely a historical episode. It was the seedbed for modern strategic thinking, and its lessons remain profoundly relevant. One of the most apparent influences of the Cold War on the future is the continued role of great power rivalry. The United States, Russia, and China each operate with strategic imperatives shaped by decades of competition and mutual suspicion. Russia's foreign policy continues to reflect Cold War-era ideas of territorial security and spheres of influence, while China blends historical assertiveness with economic and technological ambition. The United States, on the other hand, seeks to maintain its global primacy through alliances, military presence, and technological innovation. These dynamics suggest that great power competition will remain a central feature of international relations, albeit in forms that differ from the direct ideological confrontation of the 20th century. Emerging technologies are likely to amplify the influence of Cold War-era thinking. Nuclear weapons remain central to strategic deterrence, but new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, cyber capabilities, and space-based systems, create unprecedented opportunities and risks. The Cold War established patterns for managing dangerous technologies, including arms control agreements, verification protocols, and crisis communication channels. These lessons will be crucial as nations navigate the ethical, strategic, and practical challenges of emerging technologies. Mismanagement or miscalculation in these areas could create crises as dangerous as any experienced during the Cold War, even without ideological confrontation. Global alliances and institutional frameworks shaped during the Cold War will continue to influence future stability. NATO, the United Nations, and other multilateral organizations provide platforms for dialogue, coordination, and collective security. Yet the Cold War demonstrated that alliances are not static. They are deeply shaped by perception, trust, and historical memory. Future alliances may adapt or fracture depending on how nations interpret past commitments, assess threats, and balance their interests. This dynamic underscores the importance of diplomatic foresight, flexibility, and continuous engagement in a rapidly changing global environment. Economic structures also bear the imprint of the Cold War on the future. Globalization, trade networks, and financial institutions established in the post-Cold War period were influenced by the capitalist frameworks created during the Cold War. Emerging economic powers, particularly China, are challenging these structures by establishing alternative institutions, regional trade agreements, and investment networks. The resulting economic multipolarity echoes the strategic multipolarity of the Cold War itself, creating a world in which economic competition is as central as military competition, and where control over resources, markets, and technology determines influence. The Cold War's psychological and cultural legacies will continue to shape national and individual perceptions. Memories of ideological struggle, propaganda, and near catastrophe persist in collective consciousness, influencing how societies interpret risk, threat, and opportunity. In Russia, China, and the United States, historical memory informs policy debates, political narratives, and public opinion. As new generations confront global challenges, the interpretation of the Cold War will shape how they assess international cooperation, conflict, and the ethics of power. Recognizing these psychological legacies will be essential for building trust and preventing misperceptions that could escalate tensions. Modern conflicts and flashpoints reflect Cold War patterns even in new contexts. Cybersecurity threats, territorial disputes, and regional conflicts often echo the strategic calculations of the Cold War, in which indirect confrontation and proxy engagement were preferred to direct war. For example, tensions in Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, and the Arctic involve a combination of local grievances, strategic competition, and the projection of power by global actors, an indirect continuation of Cold War logic in a multipolar environment. Understanding the strategic continuity between past and present helps anticipate potential escalation and informs efforts to manage conflict. The Cold War also provides lessons on crisis management that are increasingly relevant for future global risks. Nuclear crises, brinkmanship, and high-stakes negotiations demonstrated the necessity of communication, restraint, and contingency planning.
In the 21st century, these principles extend to global health crises, climate emergencies, and technological disruptions. The Cold War teaches that even under conditions of intense rivalry and high stakes, careful planning, dialogue, and adherence to protocols can prevent catastrophe. Future leaders must internalize this lesson, applying it across both military and non-military domains. Cultural and ideological frameworks remain a subtle yet potent influence on the future. During the Cold War, ideology shaped perception, legitimacy, and motivation. While the binary ideological struggle has diminished, competing values, governance models, and social systems continue to define global engagement. Questions about democracy, human rights, environmental stewardship, and governance efficiency shape alliances, investments, and public support. The Cold War reminds us that values and narratives matter. Even in a technologically interconnected world, perceptions influence behavior, often as strongly as objective capabilities. Environmental challenges highlight another dimension of Cold War legacies. Military-industrial activities, nuclear testing, and industrial competition during the Cold War had lasting ecological impacts. Today, climate change, resource scarcity, and ecological degradation are global challenges that transcend national boundaries. Managing these threats requires cooperation that Cold War thinking sometimes obscured. Lessons from the era balancing competition with shared responsibility, anticipating unintended consequences, and understanding long-term risks are directly applicable to contemporary environmental stewardship. Education and historical memory will shape how the future interprets and applies Cold War lessons. Simplistic narratives of victory and defeat risk misinforming policymakers and the public, while nuanced understanding encourages critical thinking, ethical reflection, and strategic foresight. Integrating Cold War history into curricula, research, and public discourse equips societies with the intellectual tools to navigate complex, multipolar challenges. Knowledge of historical continuity and change allows leaders to anticipate risks, craft innovative solutions, and avoid repeating the errors of the past. The Cold War also demonstrates the importance of humility in international affairs. Despite unmatched resources, both superpowers faced constraints and vulnerabilities. Misperceptions, miscalculations, and overconfidence could have triggered global catastrophe at several points in history. This recognition of limits remains vital in the modern era, where technology, climate pressures, and geopolitical complexity create environments in which overreach or hubris can have far-reaching consequences. Understanding the limits of power and balancing ambition with prudence is a key lesson for navigating 21st century challenges. Looking forward, the Cold War legacy suggests that humanity's most pressing challenges will require integrating lessons from the past with innovations for the future. Nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and climate change represent interconnected domains of risk that cannot be addressed solely through traditional military or political means. Multilateral cooperation, ethical governance, scientific collaboration, and strategic foresight will be essential. The Cold War provides both warnings and tools. It shows the consequences of unrestrained competition, the power of diplomacy, and the importance of structures for managing high-stakes interactions. In conclusion, Part 12 positions the Cold War not merely as history, but as an enduring influence shaping the future. Its lessons on ideology, strategy, technology, human psychology, diplomacy, and ethics remain critical for navigating a complex, interconnected, and multipolar world. While the 20th century ideological confrontation is over, the patterns it created, rivalry, competition, technological acceleration, and strategic thinking continue to define global interaction.
Even more than half a century after its inception, the Cold War continues to cast long shadows over contemporary global dynamics. Part 13 examines how the strategic, technological, and psychological frameworks established during the Cold War continue to shape geopolitics, international institutions, and societal behavior in the 21st century. While the direct ideological struggle between capitalism and communism has faded, the patterns of competition, rivalry, and influence that defined the Cold War remain integral to understanding the present world order and anticipating future developments. The post-Cold War era, often heralded as a moment of liberal triumph, revealed the resilience of old rivalries under new forms. Russia's reassertion of influence in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia demonstrates the enduring significance of historical security concerns. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, conflicts in Georgia, and engagement in Syria show how Cold War mentalities, particularly concerns over territorial integrity, spheres of influence, and the strategic balance, continue to guide Russian policy. Similarly, China's strategic ascent, characterized by economic expansion, technological development, and military modernization, reflects lessons learned from both the Cold War and the post-Cold War environment. While its approach is less ideologically rigid, it represents a form of strategic competition that challenges global norms established in the 20th century. Technological innovation, once a battlefield of Cold War rivalry, has become a central pillar of modern competition. The space race, nuclear research, and early computing advancements laid the foundation for the digital age. Today, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic weapons, and cyber capabilities represent the new frontiers of strategic advantage. These technologies illustrate the enduring lesson of the Cold War, that innovation, while potentially transformative for society, is deeply intertwined with national security and global power dynamics. Economically, the Cold War shaped global trade networks, financial institutions, and development strategies that continue to influence contemporary systems. The integration of former Eastern Bloc countries into global markets, the rise of China as an economic powerhouse, and the creation of alternative economic alliances reflect the long-term consequences of Cold War-era economic policies. Competition is no longer solely ideological, but also technological and economic. Global supply chains, trade agreements, and technological dependencies all carry echoes of Cold War strategic thinking, particularly the desire to secure critical resources, maintain influence, and minimize vulnerability. Cultural and societal patterns formed during the Cold War continue to inform national identities and collective memory. Generations who experienced the ideological and existential pressures of the Cold War transmitted its lessons through literature, art, and public discourse. In Russia, narratives of national resilience and existential injustice influence contemporary foreign policy. In the United States, Cold War experiences inform attitudes toward military engagement, intelligence operations, and global leadership. Even in countries that were geographically distant from the superpower conflict, the Cold War shaped political culture, public perception, and educational narratives. These enduring psychological and cultural legacies shape both domestic politics and international diplomacy, influencing how societies respond to crises, perceive rivals, and define national interest. The international security architecture established during the Cold War remains influential, even as the nature of conflict has evolved. NATO, for example, continues to serve as a cornerstone of transatlantic security, while Russia and China explore alternative strategic alignments and partnerships. Nuclear deterrence, despite reductions in arsenals, still forms the basis of strategic planning, now accompanied by cyber defense, space strategy, and advanced conventional capabilities. The lessons of crisis management, communication, restraint, and contingency planning remain essential, yet the modern context is more complex. Unlike the bipolar world of the Cold War, today's environment is multipolar, technologically interconnected, and influenced by non-state actors, making strategic calculations more intricate and uncertain. Global crises today demonstrate both the persistence and transformation of Cold War logic.
Territorial disputes, cyber operations, and resource conflicts often reflect the strategic calculus of past rivalries. For example, the South China Sea dispute illustrates the interplay of historical claims, military projection, and economic leverage, a modern manifestation of Cold War-era power competition. Similarly, cybersecurity threats highlight the evolving nature of conflict, where information can be weaponized and perception can become as important as physical control. In this sense, the Cold War provides a framework for understanding modern risk management, yet the challenges are simultaneously more diffuse and technologically sophisticated. The environmental and technological consequences of Cold War policies continue to influence contemporary decision-making. Nuclear testing, industrial mobilization, and military-industrial expansion during the Cold War created long-term ecological challenges, from radioactive contamination to resource depletion. These historical precedents inform current debates over sustainable development, technological governance, and the ethics of innovation. Humanity's responsibility to balance strategic objectives with ecological stewardship is a lesson deeply rooted in Cold War experience, demonstrating that security and survival extend beyond immediate political calculations to the preservation of global systems. Economic globalization, though accelerated in the post-Cold War period, reflects lessons from both competition and cooperation during the Cold War. Trade networks, financial systems, and technological interdependencies all reflect the strategic calculations of states seeking advantage while minimizing risk. The rise of regional economic blocs and alternative global institutions like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others illustrate how states continue to leverage economic tools as instruments of influence. Cold War-era approaches to power, negotiation, and strategic foresight remain relevant, demonstrating that economic competition is both a continuation and transformation of geopolitical rivalry. Education and historical awareness play a critical role in shaping how societies navigate the contemporary world. Simplified narratives of the Cold War risk reinforcing ideological rigidity or overconfidence, while nuanced historical understanding fosters strategic thinking, ethical reflection, and foresight. By studying the complexities, successes, and failures of the Cold War, leaders and citizens alike are better equipped to anticipate crises, evaluate risks, and seek cooperative solutions. The enduring lesson is that history is not merely descriptive, it is prescriptive, offering guidance for decision-making in an uncertain and interconnected global environment. The psychological and social legacies of the Cold War continue to shape public perception, policymaking, and international trust. Mistrust, suspicion, and caution, developed during decades of rivalry, remain embedded in institutional culture and collective consciousness. Even when the ideological stakes have shifted, the frameworks of thinking established during the Cold War guide responses to contemporary threats. Understanding these mental patterns is essential for navigating crises, reducing the likelihood of misperception, and fostering productive international engagement. The Cold War also provides insight into human resilience under high-stakes uncertainty. Populations endured decades of potential annihilation, propaganda, and political tension while continuing to innovate, create, and aspire. Civil society, artistic expression, and scientific innovation thrived even under the pressures of ideological confrontation. This resilience serves as a reminder that human ingenuity and moral courage are central to survival and progress, even in environments dominated by fear and strategic competition. Looking ahead, the Cold War's influence suggests that global governance, technological development, and conflict management will require both strategic insight and ethical reflection. New forms of competition, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, resource scarcity, and space exploration demand careful management, international cooperation, and foresight. The Cold War offers both warnings and guidance. Unrestrained rivalry can produce catastrophic outcomes, yet dialogue, negotiation, and institutional safeguards can prevent escalation.
Applying these lessons to contemporary challenges is essential for preserving stability, fostering innovation, and ensuring collective survival. In conclusion, Part 13 emphasizes that the Cold War is not a closed historical chapter, but a continuing influence shaping global politics, economics, technology, and culture. Its lessons on strategy, diplomacy, restraint, innovation, and ethics remain deeply relevant for understanding modern challenges and anticipating future developments. The Cold War's enduring relevance lies in its dual character. It is both a cautionary tale of rivalry and a guide for responsible engagement. By internalizing its lessons, societies can avoid repeating mistakes, anticipate emerging risks, and cultivate frameworks for constructive competition and collaboration. From technological innovation to environmental stewardship,
History is not predetermined, and the Cold War offers countless examples of moments in which small decisions, chance events, or individual choices could have drastically altered the course of global affairs. Part 14 examines the intriguing what-if scenarios of the Cold War, exploring how different outcomes might have reshaped geopolitics, technology, ideology, and human society. By considering these alternate histories, we gain a deeper understanding of the contingency, fragility, and complexity of the era, as well as the enduring influence of its outcomes on the modern world. One of the most consequential potential divergences in Cold War history revolves around the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Often described as the closest the world came to nuclear war, the crisis demonstrated the razor-thin margins between catastrophe and survival. Had the leaders of the United States or the Soviet Union miscalculated, even slightly, the consequences would have been catastrophic. A single misinterpreted maneuver, a delayed diplomatic message, or an aggressive military order could have triggered a nuclear exchange, annihilating millions and altering the global balance of power. Had such an outcome occurred, the post-Cold War world would be unrecognizably different. Global populations decimated, international institutions destroyed, and ideological rivalry transformed into immediate, existential survival struggles rather than measured competition. Another alternate history involves the Vietnam War. The U.S. decision to escalate military involvement in Southeast Asia shaped both domestic politics and international perceptions for decades. What if the United States had chosen a different strategy, opting for diplomatic containment rather than direct military engagement? Perhaps a negotiated settlement could have preserved more regional stability, avoided widespread devastation, and altered the trajectory of U.S.-Soviet relations. Conversely, had the Soviet Union intervened more aggressively, the conflict might have expanded into a larger superpower confrontation, creating the risk of direct war. These what-if scenarios illustrate how regional conflicts had the potential to catalyze global crises, dependent on the strategic choices of a few key leaders. The arms race itself provides another arena for alternate history speculation. The development and deployment of nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and intercontinental delivery systems created a fragile equilibrium of mutually assured destruction. What if either superpower had accelerated technological development or adopted a more aggressive posture earlier in the 1950s or 1960s? Could early nuclear preemption have been attempted, or would it have triggered catastrophic retaliation? Conversely, what if more robust arms control agreements had been implemented sooner, preventing the buildup of excessive arsenals and redirecting resources towards social and technological development? The Cold War's trajectory hinged on countless decisions within military-industrial complexes, intelligence agencies, and political offices, and even minor shifts could have radically reshaped global history. The space race also presents fascinating alternate histories. What if the Soviet Union had landed on the moon first, or established a permanent presence in space before the United States? The symbolic and strategic implications of such an outcome would have been profound, altering global perceptions of technological supremacy and ideological superiority.
The Cold War was as much a battle of symbols as it was of military capability, and success in space translated into political capital, propaganda leverage, and global prestige. A reversed outcome might have bolstered Soviet influence in the developing world, strengthened its ideological appeal, and altered the balance of technological competition in the late 20th century. Eastern Europe represents another critical point of potential divergence. The uprisings in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in the 1980s demonstrated the fragility of Soviet control and the deep desire for political reform. What if one of these uprisings had succeeded fully, resulting in a domino effect that dismantled Soviet influence decades earlier? The collapse of the Eastern Bloc might have occurred in the 1960s rather than the 1980s, reshaping Cold War alliances, accelerating the integration of former communist states into Western institutions, and dramatically changing the global ideological landscape. Conversely, harsher crackdowns or more aggressive interventions could have deepened resentment, prolonged conflict, and created a more volatile geopolitical environment. The leadership of key figures also shaped potential alternate histories. Leaders such as John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev made critical decisions under immense pressure, and different choices could have had sweeping consequences. What if Khrushchev had reacted more aggressively during the Berlin crisis, or if Kennedy had rejected compromise during the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if Gorbachev had resisted reform, or if Reagan had escalated confrontation without pursuing arms control? The personal judgments, temperaments, and risk tolerances of these leaders demonstrate the human element in shaping historical trajectories, emphasizing how individual agency intersects with structural forces in determining global outcomes. Proxy wars offer another arena for alternate Cold War scenarios. Conflicts in Korea, Afghanistan, Angola, and Central America were deeply influenced by superpower involvement. What if the Soviet Union had intervened more decisively in Afghanistan in the 1980s, potentially extending its occupation and deepening its economic strain even further? Or what if the United States had chosen to avoid direct involvement in Vietnam? These alternate histories highlight how regional dynamics and superpower competition intertwined, with local conflicts possessing the potential to escalate into broader crises. Even minor deviations in strategy or timing could have produced entirely different global alignments and outcomes. The economic trajectory of the Soviet Union also presents possibilities for alternate histories. The stagnation of the Soviet economy in the 1970s and 1980s contributed directly to the system's collapse. What if structural economic reforms had been implemented earlier, modernizing industry, agriculture, and technology? Could the Soviet Union have maintained global influence for longer, or even transitioned peacefully into a more market-oriented system while retaining strategic power? Alternatively, if the economic decline had accelerated faster due to mismanagement or global pressures, the collapse might have occurred in the 1970s, reshaping the balance of global power and redefining alliances decades earlier. Another fascinating what-if scenario concerns nuclear proliferation. The Cold War was defined by the struggle to prevent widespread nuclear conflict, yet numerous states pursued nuclear capabilities. What if countries such as China, India, Pakistan, or Israel had developed nuclear arsenals earlier, or if superpowers had failed to manage crises involving proliferation? The global security environment could have become far more unstable, with multiple nuclear flashpoints creating unprecedented risks. The decisions of both state and non-state actors highlight the delicate balance between deterrence and catastrophe, demonstrating how the Cold War's logic continues to influence contemporary security dilemmas. The cultural and psychological dimensions of alternate histories are equally compelling. Propaganda, ideological rivalry, and media narratives shaped perception and behavior in ways that could have easily diverged. What if public opinion had been more hawkish or pacifist at critical junctures? How might heightened public fear or activism have constrained leadership decisions, or alternatively, created opportunities for bolder military engagement? Cultural currents, art, film, education, and media interacted with political structures, meaning that alternate cultural evolutions could have led to divergent public sentiment, influencing both domestic and international outcomes. Finally, the environmental and technological consequences of alternate Cold War scenarios deserve attention. Nuclear testing, space militarization, and industrial mobilization had profound ecological impacts. What if nuclear accidents, environmental mismanagement, or technological failures had occurred on a larger scale? Alternate histories could have created global crises with consequences as severe as war itself, emphasizing the interconnectedness between human activity, technology, and the natural world. In conclusion, Part 14 demonstrates the fragility, contingency, and complexity of Cold War history. Every decision, crisis, and technological breakthrough carried the potential for alternate outcomes, each capable of reshaping global politics, economics, and society. These alternate histories underscore the importance of leadership, strategic foresight, and ethical consideration in managing high-stakes competition. The Cold War was not inevitable in its outcomes. It was shaped by choices, accidents, and the interplay of structural and human factors. Exploring these alternate histories allows us to appreciate the delicate balance that defined the era and to understand the stakes of contemporary global competition. The lessons extend beyond military strategy and politics to technology, economics, culture, and environmental stewardship. By examining what might have been, societies can better prepare for what might come, avoiding mistakes, anticipating crises, and cultivating resilience. Ultimately,
the Cold War may have formally ended in 1991, yet its influence persists in contemporary global conflicts and crises. Part 15 explores how the structures, rivalries, and strategic habits established during the Cold War continue to shape the 21st century, from regional disputes to global tensions. Modern conflicts, while not defined by ideology in the same stark way as the US-Soviet confrontation, often reflect the enduring frameworks, alliances, and rivalries of the Cold War era. Understanding these legacies is essential for grasping why certain conflicts persist, why some nations remain aligned in predictable patterns, and how past experiences influence contemporary decision-making. One of the clearest examples of Cold War legacy is the ongoing tension between Russia and the Western world. The dissolution of the Soviet Union left Russia with diminished influence and a strong sense of vulnerability. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, the political and military integration of former Warsaw Pact states, and interventions in neighboring countries have been interpreted by Moscow as threats to its strategic security, echoing the Cold War preoccupation with spheres of influence. Conflicts in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine illustrate the continuation of strategic thinking rooted in the Cold War, the need to maintain regional dominance, prevent encroachment, and secure national borders. These tensions reveal how historical patterns of rivalry, mistrust, and military planning persist, even in a nominally post-Cold War world. Similarly, the United States continues to manage its global commitments through alliances, military bases, and strategic partnerships established during the Cold War. The proliferation of conflicts in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia can be understood partly through the lens of Cold War-era intervention strategies, which relied on indirect engagement, proxy support, and intelligence networks. The lessons of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and other proxy conflicts continue to inform U.S. military and diplomatic decision-making. Even today, the careful balancing of intervention, diplomacy, and restraint reflects the enduring impact of Cold War strategic thought on contemporary foreign policy. Asia offers another critical example.
The division of Korea into North and South, a direct consequence of Cold War geopolitics, remains unresolved more than 70 years later. North Korea's military posture, nuclear ambitions, and isolationist policies are legacies of Cold War-era strategies and alliances. The continued presence of U.S. military forces in South Korea, along with the alliances Japan maintains with Western powers, demonstrates the long-term impact of Cold War arrangements. Similarly, China's rise as a global power reflects both a break from and a continuation of Cold War-era strategic thinking. While the nation no longer participates in ideological confrontation with the West in the same way, its approach to global influence, technological competition, and military modernization is deeply informed by lessons drawn from Cold War-era rivalry. Proxy conflicts continue to emerge as another manifestation of Cold War legacies. In regions such as the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, local disputes are often amplified by the interests of major powers seeking strategic advantage. While the ideological framing has shifted from communism versus capitalism to spheres of influence, economic leverage, and geopolitical control, the pattern of indirect intervention persists. Civil wars in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, for example, have drawn in external powers in ways reminiscent of Cold War proxy dynamics, where strategic calculations of distant nations shape local outcomes. These conflicts highlight the persistent structural logic established during the Cold War, that influence, rather than direct conquest, can be a decisive instrument of power. Economic tensions also bear the imprint of the Cold War. Trade disputes, sanctions, and investment competition often reflect strategic priorities shaped by the bipolar era. Global supply chains, technological dependencies, and control over critical resources are now central to strategic competition, echoing Cold War concerns about industrial capacity, energy security, and technological dominance. Economic instruments are employed as tools of influence and coercion, much as military support and ideological leverage were used during the Cold War. The interplay between economic competition and political strategy demonstrates the enduring relevance of Cold War thinking in a globalized context. Cybersecurity and information warfare represent a new domain where Cold War legacies are evident. The intelligence apparatuses developed during the U.S.-Soviet rivalry laid the groundwork for modern surveillance, espionage, and strategic information operations. Today, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and technological espionage are central to international competition, reflecting the same strategic logic of influence, deterrence, and vulnerability that governed Cold War operations. The digital age has amplified the stakes and speed of these interactions, creating new risks that echo Cold War anxieties in an increasingly interconnected world. Nuclear proliferation continues to be shaped by Cold War-era frameworks. The strategic logic of deterrence, verification, and arms control agreements developed during the Cold War informs contemporary negotiations with states such as North Korea and Iran. The global effort to prevent nuclear escalation relies on structures and principles established during the U.S.-Soviet confrontation, demonstrating the durability of Cold War strategies. Lessons from the era, such as the importance of communication, crisis management, and international oversight, remain critical in preventing regional conflicts from escalating into nuclear crises. Even cultural and psychological dimensions of the Cold War persist in contemporary conflict. Societies and leaders continue to interpret international actions through the lens of historical memory, often shaped by propaganda, education, and political narratives developed during the Cold War. National identity, security culture, and public perception are influenced by the collective experience of ideological rivalry, creating enduring patterns in how threats are perceived and responded to. These mental frameworks can both constrain and enable action, demonstrating that the Cold War's influence extends beyond material capabilities to the realm of human cognition and social behavior. Environmental consequences of the Cold War-era conflicts also shape contemporary security considerations. Nuclear testing, military-industrial activity, and technological experimentation created long-term ecological impacts, from radiation exposure to ecosystem disruption. Modern conflicts must account for these legacies, as environmental degradation interacts with resource scarcity, migration, and regional stability. The Cold War, in this sense, left a dual inheritance: strategic lessons and technological advancements, alongside environmental vulnerabilities that continue to influence policy and risk assessment. The Cold War's influence is also evident in the persistence of multilateral institutions and alliances. NATO, the United Nations, and other organizations established or strengthened during the Cold War continue to play central roles in conflict management, peacekeeping, and strategic coordination. These structures provide channels for dialogue, deterrence, and crisis resolution, yet they also embody the geopolitical assumptions and alignments of the Cold War era. Understanding their historical foundations is crucial for navigating contemporary conflicts, particularly in regions where alliances and commitments remain contested. Regional flashpoints in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East demonstrate the indirect legacy of the Cold War. Local disputes often reflect the lingering effects of past interventions, arms flows, and ideological competition. The Cold War's approach to indirect engagement, supporting allies, arming factions, and influencing governance, created conditions that continue to shape conflict dynamics decades later. Contemporary crises can therefore be interpreted as both new struggles and as consequences of Cold War-era interventions, highlighting the long-term interconnectedness of global power politics. Looking forward, the enduring influence of the Cold War suggests that conflict management, crisis response, and international cooperation will require careful attention to history, psychology, and strategy. Misperceptions, mistrust, and residual rivalries continue to shape behavior, emphasizing the need for diplomacy, foresight, and ethical decision-making. Emerging technologies, environmental pressures, and global interdependencies introduce new complexities, yet the strategic principles developed during the Cold War, deterrence, negotiation, risk assessment, and alliance management, remain vital tools for addressing contemporary challenges. In conclusion, Part 15 demonstrates that modern conflicts are deeply intertwined with Cold War legacies. From ongoing tensions in Eastern Europe to regional proxy wars, from economic competition to cybersecurity and nuclear proliferation.
While the Cold War is often studied in terms of geopolitics, military strategy, and economics, its influence on culture, society, and human psychology was equally profound. Part 16 examines how the ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union reshaped not only global power structures, but also the everyday lives, beliefs, and creative expressions of millions of people. From literature and cinema to education and social behavior, the Cold War left an indelible imprint on collective consciousness, shaping both individual perception and societal norms in ways that continue to resonate in the 21st century. At the heart of the Cold War was an ideological struggle which naturally extended into the cultural sphere. Both superpowers recognized the importance of narratives, symbols, and cultural influence as tools of persuasion. In the United States, the government invested heavily in promoting the values of democracy, capitalism, and freedom through media, literature, and educational initiatives. Jazz music tours, art exhibitions, and films were deployed to demonstrate the vitality of American culture, serving both as propaganda and as a means of shaping international perception. The strategy was subtle but effective.
By cultivating admiration for American cultural creativity, policymakers sought to reinforce ideological alignment and counter Soviet influence. The Soviet Union, in turn, harnessed its own cultural machinery to assert ideological supremacy. State-sponsored literature, theater, and cinema were carefully curated to glorify socialism, industrial progress, and collective achievement. The arts became a battlefield of perception, where narratives of worker heroism, revolutionary struggle, and national pride served to both mobilize domestic populations and present a compelling image to the world. Education and cultural programming emphasized loyalty, communal values, and technical achievement, creating generations whose worldview was shaped by ideological framing and a controlled information environment. Film and television emerged as particularly potent vehicles for shaping public consciousness. In the United States, Hollywood produced films that celebrated democratic values, heroism, and the triumph of the individual, often set against imagined threats of communist aggression. In the Soviet Union, cinema reinforced collective ideology, emphasizing sacrifice for the state, historical continuity, and technological progress. This cultural competition was mirrored in children's programming, literature, and even comic books, subtly embedding ideological messages into daily life. The Cold War was fought not only on battlefields and in political halls, but in classrooms, movie theaters, and living rooms around the world. Education itself was a key battleground of the Cold War. Curriculum development, textbooks, and teaching priorities were influenced by the ideological and strategic priorities of each bloc. In the United States, science and technology education received unprecedented support, motivated in part by the space race and fears of Soviet technological superiority. Programs like the National Defense Education Act encouraged mathematics, engineering, and scientific literacy, producing generations capable of competing in global technological arenas. In the Soviet Union, education was similarly aligned with ideological goals, emphasizing technical skills, historical materialism, and loyalty to the socialist state. The Cold War thus shaped the intellectual landscape of entire generations, influencing career paths, civic values, and modes of critical thinking. The psychological impact of the Cold War extended far beyond formal institutions. The constant threat of nuclear annihilation, espionage, and global tension fostered a pervasive sense of uncertainty and fear. Families conducted duck and cover drills, communities discussed fallout shelters, and public messaging emphasized vigilance against ideological infiltration. In the West, anxieties about communist subversion produced phenomena such as McCarthyism in the United States, creating social pressure, suspicion, and a culture of conformity. In the East, fears of Western influence and internal dissent fostered loyalty to the state and caution in public discourse. These shared anxieties created collective psychological experiences that influenced behavior, decision-making, and social norms for decades. Art and literature were also deeply shaped by Cold War tensions. Writers, poets, and visual artists grappled with themes of existential threat, surveillance, freedom, and ideology. In the United States, novels, films, and poetry often explored the tension between individual freedom and collective security, reflecting both societal fears and aspirations. In the Soviet Union, artistic expression navigated the boundaries of permissible critique and propaganda, producing works that were simultaneously constrained and creative, reflecting deep engagement with social, political, and ethical questions. Across the globe, the Cold War inspired imaginative exploration of dystopia, science fiction, and alternate realities, providing both commentary on contemporary anxieties and a means of collective catharsis. Music and popular culture were similarly influenced. Jazz, rock, and pop were embraced in the West as expressions of freedom, individuality, and rebellion, while the state in the East promoted folk traditions, patriotic songs, and music that reinforced ideological identity. Cultural exchange through music tours, film festivals, and international exhibitions became a subtle battleground, allowing ideas to cross borders even amid political division. The resulting cultural hybridity influenced global tastes, artistic innovation, and cross-cultural understanding, demonstrating that even during periods of intense rivalry, human creativity found ways to bridge ideological divides. Urban planning, architecture, and everyday life were also shaped by Cold War priorities. In the Soviet Union and its satellite states, massive industrial complexes, housing projects, and monumental architecture symbolized the achievements of socialism and the collective purpose of the state. In the United States, suburbanization, consumer culture, and technological infrastructure reflected confidence in capitalism, individual prosperity, and modernity. Even domestic spaces were influenced by Cold War anxieties, from the construction of backyard fallout shelters to the inclusion of civil defense protocols in school curricula. The material environment of daily life thus reflected global competition, embedding geopolitical concerns into the very fabric of society. International travel and exchange programs were used strategically to shape perceptions and build ideological alliances. Students, artists, and professionals were sent abroad to study, perform, or conduct research, exposing participants to foreign cultures while subtly promoting national values. These exchanges created enduring networks of influence, fostering cross-cultural understanding while simultaneously reinforcing strategic narratives. The Cold War's cultural diplomacy demonstrated that influence was not achieved solely through military or economic power. Ideas, art, and personal experience were equally potent tools of global engagement. Psychologically, the Cold War instilled patterns of vigilance, risk assessment, and strategic thinking that persist today. Populations internalized the lessons of crisis management, information control, and ideological competition, influencing both personal and collective decision-making. Generations grew up with heightened awareness of global interconnectedness, the fragility of peace, and the consequences of strategic miscalculation. These mental frameworks have persisted, shaping attitudes toward government, technology, international relations, and even environmental stewardship. Global media networks, journalism, and communication strategies were transformed during the Cold War. The need to project national narratives and counter opposing propaganda led to innovations in broadcasting, reporting, and international coverage. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other media initiatives created channels of influence that extended across borders, shaping public opinion and perception in ways that were unprecedented in the past. These initiatives influenced not only political outcomes, but cultural expectations, narrative structures, and information literacy, leaving a lasting imprint on how societies engage with news, information, and global events. In conclusion, Part 16 demonstrates that the Cold War was not confined to political negotiations, military standoffs, or economic competition. It profoundly reshaped human culture, social behavior, and collective psychology. Its influence permeated literature, art, film, music, education, and daily life, creating patterns of thought, expression, and social organization that continue to.
One of the most enduring and transformative legacies of the Cold War lies in the realm of science, technology, and space exploration. While the era is often remembered for ideological rivalry, proxy wars, and nuclear brinkmanship, it was equally defined by an unprecedented acceleration in technological innovation. Part 17 examines how the competitive pressures of the Cold War drove scientific advancement, reshaped economies, and transformed human understanding of both our planet and the cosmos. From nuclear physics to rocketry, computing, and spaceflight, the Cold War created conditions for breakthroughs that continue to influence the 21st century. The nuclear arms race was one of the earliest and most dramatic catalysts for scientific innovation during the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union invested vast resources in developing increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons, delivery systems, and detection technologies. This pursuit not only escalated the destructive capacity of humanity, but also stimulated advances in physics, materials science, and engineering. Research into nuclear fission and fusion laid the foundation for energy production, medical applications, and fundamental understanding of atomic structure. At the same time, the need for precision in weapons systems drove progress in guidance technologies, electronics, and computational modeling, influencing broader fields beyond military applications. Missile technology, a central focus of Cold War military competition, similarly spurred innovation. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, and tactical missile systems required sophisticated engineering, propulsion systems, and materials capable of withstanding extreme conditions. The development of these technologies created spin-off benefits in aerospace, transportation, and industrial design. Engineers trained in missile development contributed to civilian aviation, space programs, and advanced robotics, demonstrating the dual-use nature of Cold War-era innovation. The drive for precision, reliability, and speed in military applications accelerated the pace of engineering progress globally. The space race was perhaps the most visible and iconic manifestation of Cold War technological competition. Following the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, the United States accelerated its efforts to achieve parity and supremacy in space. The competition spurred remarkable advances in rocketry, satellite technology, communications, and materials science. Projects such as NASA's Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs were not merely national prestige initiatives. They represented a convergence of engineering, physics, and organizational innovation unprecedented in history. The Apollo moon landing in 1969 symbolized not only technological triumph, but also the capacity of coordinated research and development to achieve audacious goals under intense competitive pressure. Satellite technology, driven by military and scientific imperatives, transformed global communications, weather forecasting, and Earth observation. The Cold War spurred the deployment of reconnaissance satellites, early warning systems, and communication networks that laid the groundwork for the global connectivity we rely on today. The need to monitor rivals and project technological power pushed innovation in orbital mechanics, sensors, and digital transmission. These technologies, initially developed for strategic purposes, eventually became integral to civilian life, shaping everything from GPS navigation to meteorology, telecommunications, and environmental monitoring. Computing and information technology were dramatically accelerated by Cold War pressures. The demands of nuclear simulations, code breaking, and weapons design required immense computational capacity, driving advances in digital computing, algorithm development, and data processing. Early computers, while massive and limited by today's standards, laid the groundwork for modern computing, influencing fields from artificial intelligence to software engineering. The Cold War's demand for rapid, accurate, and reliable computation demonstrated the strategic value of information, a lesson that continues to shape military and civilian technological priorities today. Research into materials science, aerodynamics, and propulsion also flourished under Cold War pressures. The development of supersonic aircraft, stealth technology, and advanced vehicles required innovative materials, including lightweight alloys, heat-resistant composites, and specialized coatings.
These advancements not only improved military capabilities, but also contributed to civilian industries, from aviation to manufacturing and energy production. The iterative process of experimentation, testing, and refinement, accelerated by geopolitical urgency, produced knowledge and expertise with enduring utility. Medical and biological sciences were influenced in less direct but equally significant ways. The need to protect personnel from radiation exposure, chemical hazards, and extreme environmental conditions led to advances in protective equipment, medical diagnostics, and biological research. Additionally, the competition for strategic advantage extended to psychological and cognitive research, influencing human factors engineering, ergonomics, and training methods. These developments illustrate how Cold War imperatives shaped scientific inquiry across a broad spectrum, often in ways that improved civilian life as well as military readiness. International collaboration and competition coexisted in complex ways during the Cold War. While the US and USSR competed fiercely, scientific diplomacy occasionally fostered limited cooperation, particularly in areas such as space exploration and global monitoring. Programs like the Apollo-Soyuz test project demonstrated the potential for collaboration even amid strategic rivalry, setting precedents for joint space missions, environmental monitoring, and disaster response. These instances reveal that competition and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. Rivalry can accelerate innovation while creating incentives for shared scientific achievement. The Cold War also influenced the organization of science and research institutions. Governments invested heavily in national laboratories, research universities, and specialized agencies to maintain technological superiority. Funding priorities, talent recruitment, and strategic focus were guided by national security imperatives, creating ecosystems of innovation that endured well beyond the immediate pressures of the Cold War. Many of today's leading research institutions, think tanks, and technological companies trace their origins to Cold War-era initiatives, illustrating the enduring structural legacy of the period. Space exploration became a symbol of human aspiration as well as strategic power. While initially motivated by military considerations, the scientific curiosity unleashed by the space race transformed human understanding of the universe. Lunar missions, planetary probes, and orbital experiments expanded knowledge of planetary science, astronomy, and environmental systems. These programs inspired generations of scientists, engineers, and ordinary citizens, demonstrating the inspirational power of competition coupled with curiosity. The Cold War's technological influence extended to energy and environmental research. Nuclear energy, while initially developed for weapons purposes, became a major focus for civilian power generation. Innovations in reactor design, safety systems, and fuel processing were driven by strategic and energy security concerns. Additionally, environmental monitoring, pollution tracking, and climate research benefited indirectly from technological tools developed for military and space purposes. Computational modeling, simulation, and predictive analytics developed to manage complex Cold War systems have become foundational to modern science and industry. Weather prediction, economic modeling, epidemiology, and urban planning all rely on computational techniques refined during the Cold War. The strategic imperative to anticipate rival behavior, optimize resource allocation, and model nuclear effects provided a methodological template for understanding complex systems, bridging military and civilian knowledge domains. In conclusion, Part 17 demonstrates that the Cold War was as much a contest of ideas and innovation as it was a geopolitical struggle. The pressures of ideological rivalry and strategic competition created unprecedented incentives for scientific and technological advancement. From nuclear physics to computing, aerospace engineering to space exploration, the era produced breakthroughs that transformed human capability and reshaped the modern world. The legacy of the Cold War is evident not only in technology, but also in institutional structures, talent development, and the integration of science into global strategy. The Cold War illustrates that competition can serve as a catalyst for innovation, accelerating the development of knowledge and infrastructure in ways that shape human history for generations. Yet it also demonstrates the risks inherent in rapid technological development under conditions of tension and secrecy, reminding us of the ethical and existential dimensions of scientific progress. The interplay between strategic necessity, human creativity, and technological possibility defines the enduring legacy of the Cold War in science and technology. Ultimately, the Cold War's influence on science and technology highlights